What if your quiet Canadian town was hiding something that defied explanation? Tonight, I'm bringing you 11 deeply disturbing true stories from small towns across Canada that will make you question everything. These accounts come from real people who experience the unexplainable. For their protection, names and certain details have been altered, but I promise you, every story you're about to hear is 100% real. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Hit subscribe to Declassified Horror because you won't want to miss what happens next. Let's get started. My name is Kiaan, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been driving the ice roads up in Manitoba for 23 years now. These aren't your normal highways. We're talking frozen lakes and rivers that become roads every winter, connecting isolated communities in the far north where no permanent roads exist. It's dangerous work, but it pays well. And honestly, I thought I'd seen everything these routes could throw at me. I was wrong. This happened in February 2019. I was doing my regular run from Gillam up to Churchill, a route I'd driven over 200 times before. The weather was brutal that day, minus 40 degrees, the kind of cold that makes your breath freeze before it leaves your lungs. Visibility was maybe 20 feet in the whiteout conditions, and I could hear the ice cracking and shifting beneath my 18 wheels with every mile. That sound never stops bothering you, no matter how many times you hear it. You're always aware that you're driving on frozen water, and if you break through, you're dead. No one's pulling you out in time, not in that cold. I left Gillam around 6 in the morning. The sun barely rises that time of year, so you're driving in this perpetual twilight that messes with your head. But what really started messing with my head was the black pickup truck that appeared in my mirrors about 2 hours into the drive. Now, seeing another vehicle on the ice roads isn't unusual. But something about this truck felt off from the start. It stayed exactly the same distance behind me, maybe 100 yards back, and matched my speed perfectly. When I slowed down to check the ice thickness at a questionable section, it slowed down. When I sped up, it sped up. For 6 straight hours, that truck stayed in the exact same position behind me. Here's the thing about ice road driving. You don't maintain a constant speed. You're constantly adjusting based on ice conditions, visibility, wind, and a dozen other factors. But this truck, it was like it was connected to my rig by an invisible rope. The distance never changed, not by a foot. I tried raising them on the CB radio around hour 3. Standard protocol when you've got another driver in your vicinity. You check in, share road conditions, maybe chat to break up the monotony. Static, just static. I tried different channels, thinking maybe they were monitoring a different frequency. Nothing. Then, around hour 4, my radio crackled to life, but no one spoke. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing, and what sounded like someone listening intently. I said, "Hello? You there, buddy?" The breathing stopped, then started again. This went on for maybe 2 minutes before the radio went silent. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. I cranked up the heat in my cab and told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe their radio was malfunctioning. Maybe they had it keyed accidentally. But that breathing, it sounded deliberate, like someone was holding the button down on purpose, wanting me to know they were there. The rational part of my brain kept trying to explain it away. This was just another trucker doing the same route. Maybe they were staying behind me for safety, following my tracks. That's not uncommon on ice roads when visibility is this bad. But 6 hours? 6 hours of perfect distance, perfect speed matching, And that breathing on the radio? I should mention that my wife's birthday was the next day, February 14th. I'd promised her I'd be home for it this time. I'd missed the last 3 years because of weather delays and mechanical issues. I remember thinking about her as I watched that black truck in my mirror, thinking about how much I wanted to just get home safely. Around hour 7, I approached the way station checkpoint. It's basically a small, heated building where they verify your load and check your vehicle before you continue. I pulled in, my heart pounding, and watched my mirrors. The black truck should have pulled in right behind me. It didn't appear. I sat there for 5 minutes, engine idling, watching the road behind me. Nothing. Just empty white tundra and blowing snow. The attendant came out. Guy named Maurice. I'd known him for years. And I asked him if he'd seen a black pickup behind me. He looked at me funny and said I was the only vehicle they'd logged in the past 4 hours. I insisted someone had been following me for 6 straight hours. Maurice just shook his head and said the isolation sometimes plays tricks on people. That's when I remembered my dash cam. I have a Garmin 66W mounted on my dashboard. Records everything, front and rear. I pulled up the footage right there at the station, Maurice looking over my shoulder. We watched 7 hours of footage. My truck, the ice road, the whiteout conditions. No black pickup, nothing. Just empty road behind me the entire time. Maurice suggested I get some coffee, warm up, maybe rest for an hour. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. What I knew I'd seen. That truck was real. I saw it in my mirrors, both side mirrors and the rear view. For 6 hours. How could 3 different mirrors show me something that wasn't there? I should have stayed at that station. Should have waited for daylight, for the weather to clear. But I had 4 more hours of driving to reach Churchill, and I'd promised my wife. So I got back in my truck and pulled back onto the ice road. The black pickup reappeared in my mirrors within 5 minutes. Same distance, same speed, same position. My stomach dropped. I didn't touch the CB radio this time. I didn't want to hear that breathing again. I just drove, forcing myself to watch the road ahead, checking my gauges, anything to avoid looking in the mirrors. But I couldn't help it. Every few minutes, my eyes would flick up. And there it was. Following. Always following. Those last 4 hours were the longest of my life. The smell of diesel fuel and cold rubber filled my cab. The heater couldn't seem to warm me up. The ice cracked and groaned beneath my wheels, and all I could think about was that truck behind me, and the fact that it didn't exist. At least not according to my dash cam. Not according to Maurice at the way station. But I could see it. Even now, I can close my eyes and see it perfectly. Black paint, no visible markings, headlights that never seemed to illuminate anything. Just 2 steady points of light in my mirror. I reached Churchill around 7 p.m. The sun had set hours ago. I pulled into the depot, and just like at the way station, the black pickup never followed me in. It was just gone. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, shaking before I could even get out. I filed a report with the local RCMP detachment the next morning. They listened politely, took notes, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought the isolation and stress had gotten to me. They checked with other drivers who'd been on the routes that day. No one else reported seeing a black pickup. They pulled traffic data from the way station. No other vehicles logged. I made it home for my wife's birthday. I didn't tell her what happened, not then. What would I say? That I was being followed by a truck that didn't exist? That my dash cam showed empty road, but my eyes showed something else? I still drive that route. I need the work, and honestly, part of me needs to prove to myself that I can do it. But I don't look in my rearview mirror anymore. Not on the ice roads. I adjusted my side mirrors so I can see what's directly beside me for lane awareness, but I can't see far behind me anymore. I tell other drivers it's because of glare issues. The truth, I'm terrified of what I might see back there. Because sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch a glimpse of two headlights, staying exactly the same distance behind me, matching my speed perfectly. And sometimes, late at night when the CB radio is quiet, I hear it. That slow, steady breathing, and I know someone is listening. I never found out what was following me on the ice road that day. I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that something was there, something my camera couldn't see but my eyes could. And whatever it was, it's still out there on those frozen highways, following someone else now, staying exactly the right distance back, breathing into their radio, waiting. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, thinking about other drivers on that route, wondering if they see it too, wondering if they make it home to their families. The ice roads are dangerous enough without something impossible hunting you across the frozen wasteland. But who would believe me? Who would believe any of us? So I drive, I deliver my loads, I come home, and I never, ever look in the rearview mirror. My name is Sarah, and I'm an elementary school teacher. In September 2021, I moved back to my hometown of Biggar, Saskatchewan, after my divorce was finalized. I needed a fresh start, somewhere affordable where I could rebuild my life and focus on my career. The apartment seemed perfect. Main floor of a beautiful century-old house, hardwood floors, big windows, and the rent was incredibly reasonable. My landlord lived upstairs, a friendly older man who seemed genuinely happy to have a quiet, responsible tenant. The basement apartment, he told me, was empty and used for storage. It should have been my sanctuary. Instead, it became the place where I learned that the worst monsters are the ones who have keys to your door. I moved in on September 3rd, right before school started. I teach second grade at the elementary school near Biggar Composite High School, and I was excited to throw myself into work, into creating a normal routine. My cat Winston seemed to love the new place immediately, exploring every corner, rubbing against the vintage radiators. Those first 2 nights were blissful. I unpacked, organized my classroom materials, and fell asleep to the sound of prairie wind howling outside my windows. Old houses make noise, I told myself. Creaking floors, settling foundations, the furnace rumbling to life in the cool September nights. These were comforting sounds, sounds of a home with history. The third night, everything changed. I woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. I remember because I checked my phone, annoyed at being pulled from sleep. At first, I couldn't identify what had woken me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from directly below my bedroom. From the basement. My heart started pounding. I sat up in bed, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps continued. Not frantic or hurried, but slow and purposeful, like someone pacing. Walking from one end of the basement to the other, then back again. I grabbed my phone and waited, every muscle tensed. After about 5 minutes, the footsteps stopped. The next morning, I knocked on my landlord's door. He smiled warmly and invited me in for coffee. When I mentioned the footsteps, his expression didn't change. "Oh, that old place settles something fierce," he said, chuckling. "The heating system kicks on, pipes expand, floorboards shift. You'll get used to it. Everyone does." He was so casual, so reassuring, that I felt embarrassed for bringing it up. Of course it was the house settling. What else would it be? But Winston didn't think it was the house settling. My cat, who had been so confident and curious, started acting strange. He would sit at the top of the basement stairs. There was a door in my kitchen that led down, and stare at it for hours, ears flat against his head, tail twitching. Sometimes he would hiss at nothing, back away, and refuse to go near that door for the rest of the day. Have you ever had that feeling that something in your life is slightly wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? That's how the next week felt. Small things seemed off. I'd leave my hairbrush on the bathroom counter and find it on my bedroom dresser. I'd pour coffee in my favorite mug, a blue ceramic one my students had given me. And when I'd come back from getting dressed, it would be in a different spot on the counter. I told myself I was distracted, stressed from the new school year, still processing the divorce. I was forgetting where I put things, that's all. Then my underwear started disappearing from the laundry basket. Not all of it, just specific items. They'd reappeared days later in different drawers, folded in ways I never folded them. That's when the rational explanations started breaking down. That's when the fear started living in my chest, constant and cold. The smell of mildew from the basement seemed to grow stronger, seeping under the kitchen door, even though it was closed. At night, lying in bed, I could hear the old furnace rumbling. But underneath it, sometimes I swore I heard other sounds. Movement, breathing, the creak of floorboards that had nothing to do with settling. My own breathing sounded too loud in the quiet of those prairie nights, and I'd pull my blankets up to my chin like a child, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. On September 19th, I found the boot prints. It had rained the night before, and the ground around the house was soft mud. I was taking out the trash in the morning when I noticed them. Muddy boot prints leading from the basement door, which opened to the outside from below ground level, around the side of the house, stopping directly beneath my bedroom window. Large prints, a man's size. The basement door had been open. I could see it slightly ajar. I stood there in my pajamas and slippers, staring at those prints, and my entire body went cold despite the mild September morning. Someone had come out of the basement during the night and stood beneath my bedroom window. Just stood there, based on how the mud was compressed in that one spot. Stood there and looked up. I called my landlord immediately. He came down within minutes, examined the prints, and frowned. "Kids," he said finally. "We get teenagers sometimes, messing around in empty buildings. I'll make sure that basement door is locked properly. Don't worry, Sarah. You're completely safe." But I wasn't safe. I knew it the way you know when you're being watched. That primal instinct that kept our ancestors alive. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and everyone kept telling me I was fine. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The house creaked and groaned around me, but now every noise sounded like footsteps, like someone moving through the walls. Winston refused to sleep in my room, something he'd done every night since I adopted him 3 years ago. He stayed in the living room, staring at that basement door. 3 days later, on September 22nd, I woke up to find the basement door open. Not just unlocked, open, standing wide open into the darkness below. I know I had checked that lock before bed. I checked it every night now, multiple times, tugging on the handle until I was sure. But here it was, open, and the smell of mildew rolling up from below was overwhelming, mixed with something else. Something that smelled like body odor and cigarette smoke. I didn't go near that door. I grabbed Winston, locked myself in my bedroom, and waited for sunrise. When the sun came up, I forced myself to look around the outside of the house again. What I found made my blood turn to ice. My bedroom window is about 5 feet off the ground. There's a flower bed beneath it, and in the soft soil, I could see where the flowers had been crushed recently. But that's not what made me go numb with terror. On the window itself, I could see smudges. Fingerprint smudges on the outside of the glass, positioned exactly at eye level for someone standing in that flower bed, looking in. But here's what made it impossible: the angle. To get that position, to stand exactly there and look directly into my bedroom, you'd have to know the perfect spot. You'd have to have practiced it. And the only place you could see that exact angle, the only place you could line it up perfectly, was from inside the basement, looking up through the basement window, which offered a direct sight line to my bedroom window above. Someone had been in that basement, looking up, figuring out exactly where to stand outside to see into my room. Someone had been watching me sleep. I called the landlord again. This time, I was crying, my voice shaking as I explained the fingerprints, the angle, the open door. He arrived quickly, and for the first time, he looked genuinely concerned. "Let's check the basement together," he said. "I'll go first. If someone's squatting down there, we'll find them." We went down the basement stairs together, him in front with a flashlight. The basement was exactly as he described. Old furniture, boxes, storage items covered in dust. No evidence of anyone living there. No sleeping bag, no food, no clothes. Nothing. The dust on the floor was disturbed, but he pointed out that could be from anything. Air currents, mice, the fact that he occasionally went down there himself for maintenance. "See?" he said gently. "No one's here? You're safe, Sarah. I think maybe the stress of the divorce, the move, starting a new school year, it's getting to you. That's understandable. But you're safe here, I promise." I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly. But that night, at 2:17 a.m., the exact same time as always, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, there were 2 sets. 2 different walking patterns, 2 different weights hitting the floorboards below my bed. And I could hear voices, low and muffled, like 2 people having a conversation they didn't want overheard. I packed a bag in the dark, grabbed Winston, and left. I didn't even turn on the lights. I drove to a friend's house in Saskatoon and never went back to that apartment except to get my things with my brother present in broad daylight. I broke my lease, lost my damage deposit, $900 I couldn't really afford to lose. But I didn't care. I slept on my friend's couch for 2 months until I found a new place. On September 23, 2020, I filed a report with the RCMP. They took my statement. But without evidence of actual break-in or assault, there wasn't much they could do. The landlord hadn't committed a crime they could prove. The case went nowhere. For 6 months, I tried to move on. I threw myself into teaching, spent time in therapy processing the divorce and what had happened in that apartment. I started sleeping through the night again. Winston stopped being skittish. Life returned to something resembling normal. Then, in March 2022, I got a call from an RCMP officer. My former landlord had been arrested. Multiple women, former tenants, had come forward. He'd been installing hidden cameras in rental properties for years. They found dozens of hard drives with footage. Bathrooms, bedrooms, women in various states of undress, private moments never meant to be seen. The investigation was ongoing, they told me. They'd need me to testify about my experience. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. They never found evidence of anyone else. No second person. The basement showed no signs of long-term habitation. My landlord lived alone, had no roommate, no business partner, no accomplice they could identify. So who was the second person I heard that last night? Whose footsteps paced alongside his in that basement? Who was he talking to in those low, muffled voices? The RCMP suggested I'd imagined it, that the stress and fear had created auditory hallucinations. But I know what I heard. Two sets of footsteps, two voices. Someone else was in that basement with him. Someone who was never caught, never identified, never found. Sometimes I wonder if he's still renting out that apartment. If there's another woman living above that basement right now, hearing footsteps at 2:17 a.m., finding her things moved, feeling eyes on her while she sleeps. I wonder if she's been told the house is just settling. I wonder if she believes it. I teach my second graders about safety now, about trusting their instincts, about speaking up when something feels wrong, even if adults tell them not to worry. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes the danger isn't a stranger breaking in. Sometimes it's the person who gave you the keys, the one who smiled and promised you were safe, the one who already had access to every lock in your home. I'll never know everything that happened in that century-old house in Bigger. I'll never know who else was down there or what they were planning. All I know is that I got out, and Winston and I are safe now, in a modern apartment building with security cameras and lots of neighbors and no basement at all. But even now, in my new place, I check every lock 3 times before bed. And I never, ever sleep with my curtains open. My name is Crew, and I'm a 19-year-old environmental science student at the University of Alberta. I'm Métis, and I've always been proud of my heritage. But I'll be honest, I approached our traditional stories the way I approached everything else, with analytical thinking, looking for logical explanations. My grandmother used to tell me that some things in this world can't be understood through science alone, that our ancestors' warnings were born from real experiences, not superstition. I thought I knew better. I thought education made me smarter than the old stories. I was wrong, and what happened to me in July 2022 on an old fur trading route near Slave Lake, Alberta, proved that some warnings should never be ignored. I was visiting my grandmother that summer, staying at her small house near Slave Lake for 2 weeks before my fall semester started. I'd received a scholarship for Indigenous students in STEM fields, and I was excited to tell her about my research project on boreal forest ecosystems. She was proud. But when I mentioned I wanted to hike some of the historic Métis trading routes for my research, her face changed. She became serious in a way I'd rarely seen. "Not the old crossing," she said firmly. "That route is closed, Crew. Has been for generations. There are places in the forest that don't belong to us, places where the boundary between worlds is thin. Our people learn to respect those places, to go around them. You need to do the same." I nodded and smiled, but inside, I was already planning my hike. I'd looked at historical maps, identified the old fur trading route she was talking about. It would be perfect for my research. Old growth forest, minimal human interference. Exactly the kind of pristine ecosystem data I needed. The warnings felt like folklore. Stories meant to keep children from wandering too far. I was a university student, educated, rational. I had a GPS, a fully charged phone, proper hiking gear. What could possibly go wrong? On July 18th, 2022, I set out at 2 p.m. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, clear skies. I told my grandmother I was going to the provincial park on the main trails, and technically I started there. But within an hour, I diverted onto the old route. The forest was beautiful, dense boreal with towering spruce and pine, the ground soft with moss and needles. Birds sang overhead, squirrels chattered, everything felt alive and normal. Then, about 2 hours in, I found the bent trees. I've studied forest ecology. I know what natural tree growth looks like, how trees bend toward light, how weather and soil conditions affect their shape. This wasn't that. This was an entire grove of trees, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all bent at the exact same angle, all pointing in the same direction, as if some massive force had pushed them over, but not quite broken them. They formed a kind of archway, and beyond it, the forest changed. The birdsong stopped. Not gradually. They just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The air became oppressively humid, thick and heavy despite it being a dry summer. There was no wind movement, no rustling of leaves, nothing. The silence was so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. But I'm a scientist. I wanted to understand what I was seeing. I took photos, checked my compass, noted the GPS coordinates, 55.2847 degree N, 114.17621 degree W. Then I kept walking. The smell of wood smoke reached me about 10 minutes later, strong and distinct, like someone had just put out a campfire. I followed it, thinking maybe there were other hikers, maybe I could ask them about the strange trees. What I found made no sense. It was a hunting camp. Traditional style, the kind our ancestors would have used. A fire pit made of stones, still warm when I held my hand over it. The ashes were fresh, gray and white, not cold and scattered. There were marks on the ground where someone had sat, where bedrolls had been laid out. But there were no tracks leading in or out. The moss around the camp was undisturbed except for the camp itself. No footprints, no trail, nothing. It was as if the camp had simply materialized there, been used, and whoever used it had vanished into thin air. I knelt down, examining the fire pit, trying to find a rational explanation. The scientific part of my brain was cataloging possibilities. Maybe the moss had grown back quickly. Maybe I was missing something obvious. But then I heard it. Singing. It was in Michif, the Métis language. I recognized it as Michif even though I don't speak it fluently. My grandmother uses phrases sometimes, and I'd heard recordings in cultural classes. But this was different. The melody was old, mournful, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not echoing exactly, but surrounding me, like the forest itself was singing. I should have run. But the song was beautiful and terrible, and I felt pulled toward it, like my feet were moving without my permission. I walked deeper into the forest, following the sound, and with each step, the humidity grew worse. Sweat poured down my face. My clothes stuck to my skin. The smell of wood smoke intensified, but there was still no visible source. Then I saw the figure. It was standing in a small clearing ahead, maybe 50 feet away. At first, I thought it was someone in traditional Métis clothing, the kind you'd see in historical photos. A sash around the waist, a long coat, moccasins. The figure stood perfectly still, facing away from me. The singing continued, and I realized it was coming from this figure, though the voice seemed too loud, too resonant to come from a single human throat. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded wrong in that silent forest, too small and too loud at the same time. "Are you okay?" The figure stopped singing. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it began to turn toward me. And as it turned, I saw that something was very, very wrong. Where its face should have been, there was nothing. Not a mask, not a cloth covering, just smooth skin, like someone had erased its features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blank, pale skin stretched over where a face should be. But somehow, I knew it was looking at me. I could feel its attention, cold and ancient and utterly inhuman. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just moved, pure animal panic overriding everything else. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Not running, just walking, steady and rhythmic, matching my own pace perfectly. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down from exhaustion, they slowed down. Always the same distance behind me, never gaining, never falling back. The forest had become a maze. I passed the same bent trees 3 times, 4 times, approaching them from different angles, but always ending up back at that unnatural archway. My GPS showed me moving, the distance counter was climbing, but I kept looping back to the same landmarks. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and desperate, and beneath it, those steady footsteps behind me, and beneath that, a sensation I can't quite describe. It felt like the forest itself was watching me, waiting to see what I would do. Time stopped making sense. The sun should have been lowering, but it seemed stuck in the same position. My phone showed 2:47 p.m., then suddenly 6:23 p.m., then 4:15 p.m. The numbers made no sense. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. And when I tried to look at my GPS coordinates, the numbers kept changing, even though I was standing still. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like days, but also like minutes. Eventually, I stumbled and fell, too exhausted to get up. I lay there on the moss, gasping, waiting for those footsteps to reach me, waiting for that faceless figure to stand over me. But they stopped. The footsteps just stopped, maybe 20 feet behind me, and I could feel it standing there, watching with eyes it didn't have. Then my grandmother's voice came to me. Not actually present, but a memory of something she'd said years ago. If you ever find yourself lost in a place you shouldn't be, show respect. Acknowledge that you don't belong there, that you're sorry for trespassing, and ask for permission to leave safely. With the last of my strength, I pushed myself to my knees. I didn't look behind me. I knew better than to look. In my broken Mashif, mixing in English because I didn't know enough words, I said I was sorry. I said I was young and foolish, that I should have listened to my grandmother, that I meant no disrespect to this place or whatever dwelled here. I asked humbly to be allowed to leave. The oppressive humidity lifted slightly. A breeze moved through the forest. The first wind I'd felt in hours. And when I looked up, I could see the bent trees ahead of me. But this time, they felt different, like a doorway opening instead of closing. I walked toward them, not running, not looking back. I passed through the archway of bent trees, and suddenly I was back in normal forest. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the sound of a distant highway. I checked my phone, 11:47 p.m. I'd been in the forest for over 9 hours, but it had felt both longer and shorter than that. My GPS showed something impossible. The tracking function had been on the whole time, and it showed I'd traveled 47 kilometers. But when I overlaid that tracking data on the map, it was all within a 2-kilometer radius, looping and spiraling and crossing over itself in patterns that made no geometric sense. I made it back to my grandmother's house just after midnight. She was waiting on the porch, and the look on her face told me she knew exactly where I'd been. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just held me while I shook and cried like a child. Then she brought me inside, made me tea, and performed a traditional cleansing ceremony. She burned sage and sweet grass, said prayers in Michif I didn't understand, and placed a tobacco offering outside her door. "Some places remember," she said finally. "That crossing has always been a threshold. Our people knew to respect it, to leave offerings, to ask permission before passing through. You walked in without respect, and it showed you what lies beyond. You're lucky it let you leave." I asked her what I'd seen, what that faceless figure was. She shook her head. "Some things don't have names that should be spoken. It's enough to know they exist and to respect their spaces." That was 3 years ago, and I still live with what happened. I finished my degree, but I changed my research focus. I'm not comfortable in forests anymore, especially not alone. The scholarship I'd been so proud of, I almost gave it up because I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep. But the worst part is the dreams. They started about a week after the incident and haven't stopped. In them, I'm back in that forest, and I can understand the singing. I know the words, know what's being said, even though I still don't speak Michif when I'm awake. The songs tell stories, old stories, true stories about the land and what came before us and what remains. And in these dreams, the faceless figure stands at the edge of my vision, always watching, and I know it's waiting for something. I asked my grandmother about the dreams. She looked troubled and said, "It marked you. When you walked in that place, it saw you, and now part of you will always be connected to it. The dreams are its way of teaching you what you refused to learn before, that not everything can be understood through science, that respect and humility are their own kind of knowledge. I keep a tobacco pouch now, like my grandmother taught me. Before I go anywhere near wilderness, I leave an offering and ask permission. I listen to the warnings of elders, and I tell my story to other young Indigenous students who think education means leaving traditional knowledge behind. Science and tradition aren't opposites. They're different ways of understanding a world that's bigger and stranger than any of us want to admit. My GPS still has those coordinates saved. 55.2847 degree AN, 114.7621 degree W. Sometimes late at night I pull them up, zoom in on the satellite view, and try to see the bent trees from above. The images show normal forest, nothing unusual. But I know what's there. I know what's waiting in that place between worlds. And I know I'm lucky to have escaped with nothing more than dreams, in a language I don't speak, and the absolute certainty that my grandmother was right all along. Some warnings exist for a reason. Some places don't belong to us and never will. And some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. I still hear the singing sometimes, even when I'm awake, even in the middle of the city. Just a few notes carried on the wind, reminding me that it knows where I am, that it's still watching, still waiting. And every time, I stop whatever I'm doing and acknowledge it. Show respect. Remember that I'm alive only because it chose to let me go. That's not superstition. That's survival. My name is Bridget, and I'm an emergency room nurse at the regional hospital in Dryden, Ontario. I'm 34, a single mother to a 7-year-old daughter, and I've been working night shifts for 6 years. In that time, I've seen things that would break most people. Trauma, death, suffering that defies description. I've held the hand of a dying man while his family rushed to say goodbye. I've performed CPR for 40 minutes, knowing it was futile. I've cleaned up more blood than I care to remember. I thought nothing could shake me anymore. I thought I'd seen the worst that life could offer. Then November 2020 happened, and I learned that sometimes the worst things aren't alive at all. November 2020 was hell for healthcare workers. COVID-19 was raging, our hospital was over capacity, and we were running on fumes. Understaffed, overworked, terrified of bringing the virus home to our families. I had to leave my daughter with my mother for weeks at a time because I couldn't risk exposing her. Every shift felt like going to war, and the old wing of the hospital, built in 1949 and scheduled for demolition, had been partially reopened to handle the overflow of patients. The old wing was connected to the main hospital by a tunnel, a long fluorescent-lit corridor that smelled like mildew and antiseptic fighting a losing battle. Most of the old wing was used for storage now, outdated equipment, old files, furniture waiting to be disposed of. But during the surge, we'd reopened a few rooms on the second floor. Nobody liked working that section. It was cold despite the heating system running full blast. And there was something oppressive about those hallways. Something that made even the most practical nurses walk a little faster when they had to retrieve supplies. My shift started at 11 p.m. on November 17th, 2020. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were usually our quietest nights, if you can call any night quiet during a pandemic. I did my rounds, checked on my patients in the main wing, reviewed charts, administered medications. Standard procedure. Around 2 a.m., I went to check on the patients in the old wing. We had 3 COVID patients isolated there. Shimon in room 247, Christina in room 251, and Zion in room 254. When I entered room 247, Shimon was awake, which was unusual. He'd been sedated earlier due to respiratory distress. But he was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably calm for someone who'd been struggling to breathe just hours before. The doctor already came by, he said when I approached with my stethoscope. Just finished checking on me. Said everything looks better. I frowned. Shimon, I'm the only nurse assigned to this wing tonight, and Dr. Morrison isn't on call. You must have been dreaming. He shook his head firmly. No, I was wide awake. Older gentleman, maybe 60, very professional. Had one of those old-fashioned stethoscopes, the kind that's all metal. Wore a white coat with his name embroidered on it, though I can't quite remember what it said. German name, I think. He took my vitals, checked my chart, told me I was improving. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. COVID patients sometimes experienced confusion, especially with the medications we were using. I smiled, checked his vitals myself, which were indeed better than they'd been, and moved on to Christina's room. Christina was also awake, also unusually calm. And before I could say anything, she told me the doctor had just been by. Same description, older man, maybe 60, old-fashioned stethoscope, German-sounding name on his white coat. He'd checked her vitals, reviewed her chart, and told her she was doing well. 2 patients with the same delusion was concerning. I made a note to contact Dr. Morrison about possible medication interactions. But when I reached room 254 and Zion, who spoke limited English and had been barely conscious for days, mumbled about the doctor with the old stethoscope, I knew something was wrong. 3 separate patients, 3 identical descriptions of a doctor who didn't exist. I went back to the nurses' station in the main wing and pulled up the security footage. We'd installed cameras throughout the hospital during COVID to monitor patient rooms remotely and reduce unnecessary exposure. I scrolled through the footage from the old wing, and what I saw made my hands shake. At 1:47 a.m., a figure in a white coat entered room 247. The timestamp was clear, the movement was clear, but the figure itself, the face was pixelated, distorted like someone had scrambled that part of the image. I watched this figure approach Shyman's bed, appear to check vitals, look at the chart. Then it left and entered room 251. Same thing, pixelated face, clear white coat, professional movements. Then room 254. I replayed the footage 3 times. Every other detail was crystal clear. The room numbers on the doors, the equipment, the patients in their beds. But this figure's face was digitally corrupted in every single frame, across 3 different cameras. That doesn't happen. Camera glitches don't follow a person from room to room while keeping everything else in perfect focus. My hands were shaking as I called my supervisor. She listened to my report, reviewed the footage herself, and suggested it was a technical malfunction combined with patient confusion. But I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She told me to finish my shift and we'd discuss it in the morning. At 4 a.m., I needed to retrieve additional PPE from the storage area in the old wing. The tunnel felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder, casting shadows that seemed to move. The squeak of my rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum echoed too loudly in the silence. I could hear distant ventilator sounds from the patient rooms, the steady beeping of monitors. But underneath that, something else. Footsteps. Not mine. Someone else walking in the old wing. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe another nurse had come to help. No answer. But the footsteps continued, steady and purposeful, somewhere in the hallway ahead of me. I should have turned back. But I'm a nurse. We don't run from things we don't understand. We investigate. We solve problems. So I walked toward the sound, passing the reopened patient rooms, heading deeper into the condemned section of the old wing. That's when I found the file room. The door was ajar, which was strange because this area was supposed to be locked. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with decades of patient records. One cabinet was open, and a chart lay on the floor, as if it had been recently pulled and dropped. I picked it up. The paper was yellowed and brittle, dated 1957. Room 247, the same room where Shyman was now. The patient's name was different, but the symptoms were identical. Respiratory distress, difficulty breathing, the same vital sign patterns I'd seen on tonight's patients. I pulled more charts. Room 251, 1957, same symptoms. Room 254, 1957, same symptoms. And stamped across each chart in red ink, deceased. All 3 patients from 1957 had died, and according to the notes, they died within hours of their conditions mysteriously improving. The attending physician's signature was on each chart. Dr. Damari. The footsteps behind me stopped. I turned slowly, and at the end of the hallway, maybe 40 feet away, I saw him. He stood perfectly still under a flickering fluorescent light. White coat, old-style stethoscope around his neck, gray hair, maybe 60 years old. But his face, God, his face was wrong. It wasn't pixelated like in the security footage. It was clear, but it didn't look entirely solid, like I was seeing him through water or old glass. And his eyes, they were hollow, exhausted, filled with a grief so profound it made my chest hurt to look at him. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing that same steady rhythm I'd heard before. He reached the wall at the end of the corridor, a solid wall, no door, and walked straight into it. Not through it, not around it. Into it, like it wasn't there. And then, he was gone. I stood there, clutching those patient charts from 1957, my breath coming in short gasps, my professional composure completely shattered. I'm a nurse. I deal in facts, in science, in things I can measure and treat. What I'd just seen didn't fit into any framework I understood. I left the old wing. I finished my shift in the main hospital, but I refused to go back to that section. When my supervisor asked why, I showed her the charts from 1957. I told her everything, the patient's descriptions, the security footage, the figure I'd seen. She listened, and I could see she wanted to dismiss it, wanted to explain it away as stress and exhaustion and the trauma of working through a pandemic. But she couldn't explain the charts. She couldn't explain why 3 patients in 2020 had described a doctor who matched the description of Dr. Damari, who died in 1957. She couldn't explain the security footage. I contacted my union rep the next day. I told them I would not work in the old wing under any circumstances. They pushed back. We were understaffed. Every nurse was needed. But I held firm. I'd seen too much, and I wasn't going to expose myself to whatever was happening in that place. The hospital administrator pulled the records on Dr. Damari. He'd been a well-respected physician, dedicated to his patients, working at the hospital since it opened in 1949. In 1957, he lost 3 patients in one night, rooms 247, 251, and 254. The same rooms. They'd all shown signs of improvement, and then suddenly crashed and died. Dr. Damari blamed himself. A week later, he died by suicide in the hospital basement. The official cause was ruled as depression and guilt over the patient deaths. The old wing was demolished in March 2021 as scheduled. They said it was due to structural issues and asbestos. But I know the real reason. Other nurses had started reporting similar experiences. A doctor who shouldn't exist making rounds in the night, patients describing visits from a physician who'd been dead for over 60 years. Shimon, Christina, and Zion all recovered from COVID. They were among the lucky ones. But sometimes I wonder if they recovered because of modern medicine, or because Dr. Damari, whatever he was, couldn't save his patients in 1957 and was trying to make amends in 2020. I still work at the hospital, but only in the new wing now. I still work night shifts because single mothers need the shift differential to pay the bills. But sometimes, when I'm walking down an empty hallway at 2 a.m., I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A figure in a white coat, old-fashioned stethoscope around the neck, standing in a doorway or at the end of a corridor. And sometimes, in the reflection of a window or a medicine cabinet, I see him watching me. Not threatening, not malevolent, just watching. With those hollow, grief-stricken eyes, still making his rounds, still trying to save the patients he lost so many years ago. I don't tell people this story often. Healthcare workers are already dealing with enough. PTSD from the pandemic, moral injury, impossible workloads. Adding ghost stories to that burden feels cruel. But it happened. I have the security footage saved on a flash drive, though the hospital officially claims it was corrupted data. I have copies of those patient charts from 1957, though the hospital says they were supposed to be destroyed years ago. And I have the memory of Dr. Damari walking into that wall. His shoulders slumped with the weight of guilt he'd carried for over 60 years, still trying to do his job, still trying to help, even in death. The hospital is supposed to be a place of healing, a place where we fight against death with everything we have. But what happens when death doesn't end the fight? What happens when guilt and dedication are so strong they transcend mortality itself? I don't have answers. I'm just a nurse who works the night shift, who's seen things that don't make sense, who checks over her shoulder a little more often than she used to. And every November, when the anniversary of that night comes around, I leave an extra cup of coffee at the nurse's station, just in case Dr. Damari is still making his rounds, still trying to save the ones he couldn't save before. Some people call it superstition. I call it respect. Because whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's something profoundly human about a dedication so strong it refuses to end, even when life does. And in a profession where we see death regularly, where we fight impossible battles every day, maybe that kind of dedication, even in its tragic, supernatural form, deserves acknowledgement. The old wing is gone now, demolished and cleared. They're building a parking lot where those rooms used to be. But sometimes, late at night when I'm leaving my shift, I see someone standing in that empty lot. A figure in a white coat, old stethoscope around the neck, looking up at where the second floor used to be. Looking for rooms that no longer exist, for patients who've long since moved on. And I wonder if he'll ever find the peace he's looking for, or if he's condemned to make rounds for eternity, trying to fix the one night where everything went wrong, trying to save the patients who can't be saved. I hope he finds peace. But part of me thinks he won't. Not until he forgives himself for something that was never his fault to begin with. That's the real horror, isn't it? Not the ghost itself, but the realization that guilt and regret can trap us forever. That sometimes the worst prisons are the ones we build ourselves. And that no amount of dedication, no matter how pure, can change the past. I'm a nurse. I save who I can, I mourn who I can't, and I keep going. It's all any of us can do. But Dr. Damari never learned that lesson. And now he's paying the price in an afterlife of endless rounds, endless guilt, endless attempts to fix what can't be fixed. Sometimes I whisper a prayer for him when I pass that empty lot. Not because I'm religious, but because everyone deserves rest eventually. Even the dead who won't stay dead. My name is Ezra, and I'm a real estate agent. At 41, I thought I had life figured out. I'd spent 15 years in Vancouver's cutthroat real estate market, made good money, but burned out completely. The traffic, the noise, the constant pressure, I was done. In March 2023, I bought a beautiful house in Tofino, BC, a small coastal town known for its beaches, surfing, and tight-knit community. It seemed perfect. Ocean views, cedar shake roof, garden space, and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. I was looking for a simpler life, a place where community still meant something. I found community, all right. Just not the kind I expected. The house was near Chesterman Beach, a prime location that I got for surprisingly below market value through Royal LePage. The previous owners seemed eager to sell, which I attributed to financial issues or maybe a divorce. I signed the papers, went through the 60-day closing period, and moved in on March 15th, 2023. The sound of ocean waves became my constant background noise. Foghorns echoed at night, and the smell of cedar and salt air filled every room. It felt like paradise. Within days, my new neighbors started welcoming me. Cookies on the doorstep, friendly waves, invitations to coffee. Everyone seemed genuinely happy I'd moved in. My neighbor to the left, a woman in her 50s, suggested I join the private Facebook group for our area, Chesterman Beach Community Circle. She said it was the best way to stay informed about neighborhood events, share recommendations, and really integrate into the community. I joined immediately. I'm social media savvy. I'd used Facebook groups for years to network, find clients, stay connected. This group had about 150 members, all residents of our small neighborhood. The posts seemed normal at first. Recommendations for plumbers, photos of sunsets, lost pet alerts, discussions about beach cleanup days. Everyone was friendly, supportive, using lots of heart emojis and exclamation points. It felt wholesome, exactly what I'd hoped for. On my 5th night in the house, around 11 p.m., I heard screaming. Not distant, not muffled. Loud, terrified screaming coming from a house maybe 3 doors down. It lasted for about 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I grabbed my phone, considered calling the police, but decided to check the Facebook group first. Maybe someone else had heard it. Maybe there was an explanation. I posted, "Did anyone else just hear screaming coming from the blue house on the corner? Should we check if everything's okay?" The responses came within minutes, but they weren't what I expected. "That's normal. Don't worry about it. You'll get used to it. Every neighborhood has its quirks. Welcome to Tofino." No explanation. No one saying it was a TV, or teenagers messing around, or someone having a nightmare. Just variations of, "That's normal," with cheerful messages. When I replied, asking what they meant by normal, my comment disappeared. Not deleted by me, just gone. I refreshed the page. My entire post was gone. I messaged the woman who'd invited me to the group. "Hey, I posted about hearing screaming and my post disappeared. Did you see it?" She responded immediately, "Facebook can be glitchy. Don't worry about it. See you at the beach cleanup on Saturday." That's when I started paying attention to patterns. Over the next week, I watched the group carefully. Any post from a newcomer that asked questions beyond surface-level pleasantries would vanish within hours. A couple who'd moved in 6 months ago posted asking about strange sounds in their basement. Deleted. Someone asked why so many houses had the same security system. Deleted. A new resident mentioned seeing people gathering in the woods behind the neighborhood at night. Deleted. And that person was removed from the group entirely. But posts from long-term residents? Those stayed up. They'd share photos, chat about local politics, organize events. And buried in those conversations, if you paid close attention, were references to things that made no sense. Looking forward to the monthly gathering, someone would comment, "Remember the arrangement?" Another would reply, "Tradition keeps us strong." A third would add. Whenever I asked what these phrases meant, either my comment would disappear or I'd get vague, overly cheerful non-answers. Have you ever felt like everyone around you is in on a joke you don't understand? That's what it felt like, except this wasn't a joke. This was something else entirely. On March 28th, I created a fake Facebook profile. Generic name, stock photo, claimed to be a longtime Tofino resident. I sent join requests to several local groups, including some private ones I'd seen mentioned in comments. One group accepted me. Chesterman Traditions, private. This group had the same members as the public community group, but the content was completely different. There were posts going back years, talking about the arrangement explicitly. Photos of monthly gatherings in the woods. People in a circle, holding candles, all wearing the same small silver pin on their clothing. References to contributions and maintaining the balance and protecting our way of life. And there were posts about me, about the previous owners of my house, why they'd left, about other people who'd moved in and moved out quickly. The tone was casual, matter of fact, like they were discussing property maintenance. "The new resident in the Miller house is asking questions," one post said. "Standard protocol," someone replied. Give it 2 weeks. They always either understand or leave. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through years of posts. This wasn't some benign community tradition. This was organized, systematic, and every single neighbor who'd smiled at me, brought me cookies, invited me to coffee, was part of it. Then I received a message on my real Facebook account. No name, just a blank profile. The message had no text, only photos. Photos of my house, from inside. My living room, my kitchen, my bedroom. The timestamps showed they'd been taken over the past 2 weeks, during hours when I'd been home alone. Someone had been in my house, taking pictures while I was there, and I'd never known. I couldn't breathe. I checked every door, every window. Everything was locked. I had good locks. I checked them obsessively since moving in. But someone had been inside, multiple times, photographing me in my own home. The next message came an hour later. Community meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. Town Hall. Attendance expected. I should have left right then. Should have thrown everything in my car and driven back to Vancouver. But part of me needed to understand, needed to see what I was dealing with. So I went to the meeting. The town hall was packed, maybe 100 people, all neighbors, all wearing casual clothes and friendly expressions. And as I walked in, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. They were all wearing the same small pin on their shirts or jackets. Silver, circular, with a symbol I couldn't quite make out. How had I never noticed this before? The meeting started normally. Discussions about upcoming events, beach erosion concerns, tourism management. But when I walked in, something changed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned to look at me, and their smiles. God, those smiles didn't reach their eyes. Too wide, too maintained, like masks they were holding in place. I sat in the back, and the meeting continued. But I noticed people kept glancing at me. And whenever I tried to join a conversation during the break, the group would disperse, reforming elsewhere, always just out of my reach. I was being isolated in a room full of people, and it was being done so smoothly, so deliberately, that I knew this wasn't the first time they'd done it. One man approached me. He'd been at my house the first week, welcoming me with homemade jam. "How are you settling in?" he asked, that too friendly smile fixed on his face. "Fine," I said, though I've been curious about some things I've seen online. His smile didn't waver. The internet can be confusing. Best to focus on real community connections. He touched the pin on his jacket, a gesture so subtle I almost missed it. We take care of our own here. People who fit in, who understand our values, they thrive. People who ask too many questions. He trailed off, shrugging. They tend to find Tofino isn't for them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ocean waves that had seemed soothing now sounded menacing. The foghorns felt like warnings. I kept thinking about those photos, about someone in my house, about an entire community united in something I didn't understand and wasn't invited to join. The next morning, I called Royal LePage and listed my house. My agent was surprised. I'd only been there 2 weeks. I told her I'd made a mistake, that Tofino wasn't for me. She tried to talk me out of it, mentioned I'd take a significant loss selling so quickly. I didn't care. I needed out. The house sold fast, too fast. A couple from Victoria put in an offer within 3 days, no inspection, cash sale. I accepted immediately. During the paperwork, I tried to warn them. "The neighborhood is unusual," I said carefully. There's a community dynamic that might not be for everyone. They smiled. We've heard wonderful things about the community here. Very tight-knit. That's exactly what we're looking for. I moved out on April 18th, 2023. 1 month after moving in, I took a $40,000 loss on the sale. Best money I've ever spent. But I couldn't let it go completely. I kept my fake Facebook profile, kept monitoring the groups from a distance. The new owners joined Chesterman Beach Community Circle within 5 days. At first, they posted enthusiastically. Photos of their new home, questions about local restaurants, excitement about beach access. Then, 2 weeks after moving in, their posts changed. More measured, fewer questions. And then I saw a photo of them at a community event, and there it was. Each of them wearing a small silver pin. They stopped asking questions entirely after that. They'd either understood or I don't know what the alternative is. I don't want to know. I'm back in Vancouver now, back in my apartment, back in the noise and traffic I thought I hated. But at least here, people are honest about not caring. At least here, if your neighbors ignore you, it's because they're busy. Not because you're not part of some arrangement you were never invited to join. I still have screenshots of those Facebook posts, saved on a hard drive. I've thought about going to the police, but with what? Screenshots of vague posts about gatherings and arrangements. Photos that could be explained away as a security system malfunction. The fact that everyone in a small town knows each other and has community traditions. Sometimes I search for news from Tofino, looking for something that would explain what I witnessed. Missing persons, unusual incidents, anything. But there's nothing. Just articles about tourism, surfing competitions, environmental initiatives. Tofino maintains its reputation as a beautiful, welcoming coastal paradise. And maybe for some people, it is. Maybe if you're willing to wear the pin, attend the gatherings, be part of the arrangement, whatever that means. Maybe Tofino is everything it promises to be. But for outsiders who ask questions, for people who want to understand before they commit, Tofino has a way of making you leave. Not through violence or overt threats, but through the suffocating realization that an entire community is united in something, and you're not part of it, and you never will be. The worst part isn't even what they did. It's not knowing what they did, or why, or what would have happened if I'd stayed longer. It's the uncertainty, the gaps in understanding, the realization that beneath the friendly surface of that beautiful coastal town was something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I tell myself I overreacted, that it was probably just a close-knit community with insider jokes and traditions that seemed weird to newcomers, that the photos could be explained, that my paranoia got the better of me. But then I remember those smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Those conversations that stopped when I entered. That systematic way they isolated me while pretending to be welcoming. And I know I didn't imagine it. There's a reason that house sold below market value. There's a reason the previous owners were eager to leave. There's a reason some people thrive in Tofino and others leave within months. And there's a reason I wake up sometimes, heart pounding, thinking I hear ocean waves and foghorns, even though I'm hundreds of miles inland now. Because some places look like paradise on the surface. But if you dig just a little deeper, you find something else entirely. I'm a real estate agent. I'm supposed to sell the dream of community, of belonging, of finding your perfect place. But now I know that sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that look the most inviting, the ones where everyone smiles and waves and welcomes you in. Until you ask the wrong questions. until you see what you're not supposed to see. Until you realize that the community you wanted to join has been watching you all along, waiting to see if you'll understand the arrangement or if you'll be another person who just didn't fit. I didn't fit. And I'm grateful for that, even if I'll never fully understand what I escaped. Sometimes ignorance isn't bliss. Sometimes it's survival. My name is Gyro, and for 25 years, I was a provincial park ranger near Whitehorse, Yukon. In that time, I've seen bears maul campers, watched hypothermia take experienced hikers, found bodies that had been missing for months. The wilderness doesn't care about your experience or your preparation. It's indifferent, massive, and unforgiving. I thought I understood that. I thought I'd seen everything the wild could do to people. Then August 2018 happened, and I learned that sometimes the wilderness isn't indifferent at all. Sometimes it's hungry. August 14th, 2018 started like any other summer day in the Yukon. The midnight sun was in full effect, meaning daylight 20 hours a day, which always disorients tourists who aren't used to it. I arrived at the ranger station at 7 a.m. for my shift, checked the overnight logs, nothing unusual. Around 10 a.m., I got a call from a day hiker who'd found something strange on one of our remote trails, an abandoned campsite with all the gear still set up. That's not unusual by itself. Sometimes campers get spooked by wildlife and abandon their sites, planning to come back with help. But the hiker said the tent was zipped shut, food was still on the picnic table, and a car was parked at the trailhead with the keys sitting on the driver's seat. That was unusual enough for me to drive out and check it myself. The campsite was about 8 kilometers in on the Raven Creek Trail, one of our less traveled routes. Beautiful area, dense spruce forest, crystal clear creek, absolute silence, except for the occasional bird call. When I arrived, everything was exactly as the hiker had described. A family-sized tent, properly staked and secured. Coleman camping stove on the picnic table with a pot of what looked like oatmeal, still half full but cold. 4 bowls set out, 4 chairs around the table, but 2 of them were knocked over backward, like someone had stood up violently. And on the ground near the tent, a single child's shoe. Size looked like maybe a 7-year-old. I called it in immediately and began standard protocol. Checked the tent first. 4 sleeping bags, personal effects scattered around, wallets and phones left behind. The phones were locked, but I could see camping permits and IDs in one of the wallets. Family of 4, parents in their late 30s, 2 kids aged 7 and 10. They'd checked in for a 3-day camping permit starting August 12th. What made my skin crawl was how it looked like they'd vanished mid-meal. The oatmeal was congealed but not spoiled, suggesting maybe 12 to 24 hours. Coffee cups still half full. A book lying open on one of the chairs, pages fluttering in the slight breeze. It was like someone had hit pause on a normal family breakfast, and everyone had simply ceased to exist. I established a perimeter and called for a full search and rescue operation. Within 4 hours, we had 20 SAR volunteers, 2 RCMP officers, and my K9 partner, a German shepherd named Kabir, who I'd worked with for 6 years. Kabir was the best tracking dog in the territory, never failed to find a scent trail. Except this time, he did. Kabir circled the campsite, whining, ears back. He picked up something, I could see his body language change, and started toward the tree line. But after maybe 50 meters, he stopped. Just stopped dead, refused to go further. Started whining again, that high-pitched sound dogs make when they're genuinely distressed. I'd never seen him refuse to track before. Never. We did a grid search of the entire area, expanding in concentric circles from the campsite. Nothing. No footprints beyond the immediate campsite area, which was impossible given the soft ground around the creek. No broken branches, no disturbed vegetation, no signs anyone had walked into the forest. 4 people don't just vanish into thin air. While the search teams worked, I went through the family's personal effects more carefully, trying to find anything that might tell us where they'd gone. That's when I found the camera, a nice digital Canon, expensive model. The father had been taking a lot of photos. I scrolled through them on the camera's display screen, and what I saw made my hands start shaking. The family had taken dozens of photos over their first day and a half of camping. Kids playing by the creek, mom reading in a camp chair, dad cooking dinner. Typical family vacation shots. But in every single photo, every single one, there was a figure in the background. Distant, maybe 100 meters away, standing at the edge of the tree line. In some shots it looked vaguely human-shaped. In others, it was just a dark, vertical blur. But it was in the exact same relative position in every photo, like it had been following them, staying just at the edge of visibility. Here's what made it impossible. In several photos, the kids were looking directly at where this figure should have been, smiling, waving at the camera. If someone had actually been standing there, they would have noticed. They would have said something, asked who that person was. But according to the timestamps and the photos themselves, this family had no idea they were being photographed with something in the background of every shot. I showed the photos to the RCMP. We enhanced them, tried to get a clear image of the figure. In every photo, that area was distorted, pixelated, like the camera couldn't quite focus on it properly, even though everything else in the frame was crystal clear. One of the officers, a 20-year veteran, looked at those photos and went pale. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "Different park, different family. 7 years ago. Never found them either." The search continued for 3 days. We brought in helicopters, expanded the radius to 10 kilometers, checked every trail, every clearing, every possible location. Nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. On the 4th day, something else happened that made this go from a missing persons case to something I still can't explain. 3 separate hikers, people who didn't know each other, coming from different trailheads, contacted the ranger station reporting the same experience. They'd been hiking, feeling fine, when they suddenly felt an overwhelming compulsion to walk off trail toward a specific area of the forest. They described it as being called, like a voice in their head that wasn't quite a voice, more like a knowing that they needed to go in that direction. All 3 resisted and turned back, but all 3 reported the same location, about 2 kilometers northwest of where the family had vanished. I knew that area. Been through it hundreds of times. Nothing special about it, just dense spruce forest like everything else around there. But I took coordinates from all 3 hikers, triangulated the location they described, and headed out there alone. I shouldn't have gone alone. That violated every protocol we had. But something about this situation made me think a large group would spook whatever was happening. I know how that sounds. I was a park ranger, trained in wildlife biology and search and rescue, not supernatural investigation. But after 25 years in the wilderness, you develop instincts, and my instincts were screaming that this was different. I found the spot around 4 p.m. Still full daylight thanks to the midnight sun, which should have been comforting but somehow wasn't. The temperature was normal for August, maybe 18 degrees Celsius. But the moment I entered this particular area, I felt cold. bone-deep cold, the kind that no amount of layers can fix. Then I saw the circle. It was maybe 15 meters in diameter, a perfect circle of dead vegetation. Not brown or dying, completely gray and brittle like it had been dead for years. But everything outside the circle was green and healthy. I'd never seen anything like it in 25 years of wilderness work. No disease pattern creates perfect circles like that. No natural phenomenon explains it. I stepped into the circle, and my watch stopped. Just froze at 4:17 p.m. I pulled out my GPS unit. The screen was glitching, showing coordinates that jumped around randomly. My radio started emitting static, and my phone was completely dead, despite being fully charged when I'd left. The silence in that circle was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the trees. Just nothing. Like I'd stepped into a void that looked like forest, but wasn't actually part of the natural world anymore. Then I heard them. Voices. Distant but clear enough to recognize as human. A woman's voice calling, "Gyro, over here." A man's voice, "We're here, we're okay." Children laughing. And here's the thing that made my blood freeze. They were using my name. These people I'd never met, who'd vanished 3 days ago, were calling my name. Every part of my training said, "Don't follow voices in the wilderness." Auditory, Argana. Hallucinations are common in isolation. Sound carries weird in the forest. But these weren't hallucinations. They were too clear, too specific. And against every instinct of self-preservation, I followed them. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, though my frozen watch couldn't confirm that. The voices stayed just ahead, always out of sight, always calling. "This way, Hiro. We need help. Please." The forest around me started to feel wrong. The trees looked the same, but the spacing was off. The undergrowth was too uniform. The light had a quality that didn't match the midnight sun I'd known for decades. Then I stepped into another clearing, and there it was. The family's campsite. Same tent, same picnic table, same knocked-over chairs, same pot of oatmeal on the stove. Everything exactly as I'd found it 3 days ago. But this was impossible. I was at least 5 or 6 kilometers from the original site, in completely different terrain. I checked my GPS. When it finally got a signal, it showed coordinates 60.4782 degree N, 135 on 0934 degree W. The original campsite had been at 60.5123 degree N, 135 on 1056 degree W. 43 kilometers apart. 43 kilometers. And yet here was their campsite, identical down to the position of that single child's shoe on the ground. The voices stopped. The forest went silent again, and I realized I was standing in that bone-deep cold again, and whatever had called me here was close. Very close. I could feel it watching, feel its attention like weight on my chest. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Crashed through the undergrowth, following my GPS back toward the trailhead, and the forest fought me every step. Branches grabbed at my clothes, roots seemed to rise up to trip me, and behind me I could hear footsteps. Not running, just walking, steady and unhurried, knowing they didn't need to rush because the forest was on their side. I made it out as the midnight sun finally dipped below the horizon, giving us those few hours of twilight we get in August. Emerged onto the trail maybe half a kilometer from where I'd parked, though according to my GPS, I'd covered 12 kilometers. The math didn't work, but I didn't care. I got to my truck and drove straight back to the station. I filed a report, detailed everything I'd seen. The RCMP looked at me like I'd lost my mind. The Parks Canada supervisor suggested stress and isolation had affected my judgment. They sent another team to the coordinates I'd recorded. They found normal forest. No circle of dead vegetation. No duplicate campsite. Nothing. The family was never found. After 2 weeks, the search was officially suspended. The case remains open but inactive. The RCMP file shows 4 people missing, presumed dead due to exposure or wildlife encounter, though no evidence of either was ever found. Parks Canada closed that section of the park 6 months later, said it was for trail maintenance and wildlife management. The temporary closure sign went up in February 2019. It's still there. If you check Parks Canada's website, that area still shows as temporarily closed, no reopening date given. I quit 6 months after the incident. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't walk those trails knowing what was out there, knowing that the wilderness I'd spent 25 years protecting and understanding was capable of things I couldn't explain or protect people from. Sometimes I still dream about it. I'm back in that circle of dead vegetation, and the voices are calling my name. And this time, I can see them. The family, standing just beyond the tree line, waving at me to join them. And behind them, that figure from the photos, finally close enough to see clearly. Except I always wake up before I can see its face, and part of me knows that's the only reason I'm still sane. I moved to Edmonton, work at a hardware store now. People ask sometimes why I left Park Service, and I tell them I wanted to be closer to family, less isolation. The truth? I left because I finally understood that the wilderness isn't just indifferent. Sometimes it's aware. Sometimes it's hungry. And sometimes it takes people for reasons that have nothing to do with hypothermia or bears or getting lost. There are places in this world that don't follow the rules we think govern reality. Places where the boundary between what is and what shouldn't be gets thin. That family found one of those places, or maybe one of those places found them. And I came close enough to see the edge of it before something, luck, instinct, or maybe just mercy, let me turn back. The Yukon wilderness is beautiful, majestic, awe-inspiring. And somewhere in it, there's a family of 4 who sat down for breakfast one August morning and never got to finish their meal. Their tent is probably still there, collapsed by now. Their car was eventually towed from the trailhead. But sometimes I wonder if somewhere, in a version of that forest that exists just slightly left of ours, they're still there, still at that table, still waiting for whatever called them to finally show itself. And I wonder how many other families, other hikers, other people who got listed as lost in wilderness over the years actually found that same place. How many of those unsolved disappearances aren't accidents at all, but something far worse? I don't go camping anymore. Don't even like going to parks. The wilderness and I had an understanding for 25 years, and then it showed me that I never understood it at all. Some people say I should have kept searching, should have done more. But they weren't there. They didn't hear those voices. They didn't see that impossible campsite or feel that presence in the forest. I did what I could. And then I did the only thing that made sense. I left, while whatever is out there still let me. My name is Ainsley, and I'm a 23-year-old pharmacy student at Dalhousie University. I'm first-generation Canadian. My parents immigrated from India before I was born. And I've always been proud of how hard I've worked to get where I am. Pharmacy school is brutal, competitive, and expensive. But I made it through on scholarships and determination. In January 2024, I started my rural placement requirement, 8 weeks at a small independent pharmacy in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. It was supposed to be straightforward. Dispense medications, counsel patients, learn the business side of pharmacy. Instead, I discovered something that's been happening in that quiet fishing village for 40 years. Something that cost me my career and maybe my sanity. And 3 months after I left Pugwash, it started happening to me too. Pugwash is tiny, population maybe 700, sitting right on the Northumberland Strait. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the pharmacy is also the post office, where the same families have lived for generations. When I arrived on January 2nd, 2024, the cold Atlantic wind was rattling the windows of my little rental apartment, and I could smell the salt air mixed with wood smoke from every chimney in town. The pharmacist who owned the place was a man in his 60s named Kiaan. He'd run the pharmacy for 30 years, knew every patient by name, and seemed genuinely excited to have a student. The pharmacy itself was in an old building, probably from the 1950s, with creaking wooden floors and that distinctive smell all pharmacies have. Chemical compounds, paper, and something vaguely antiseptic. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, and the ancient pill counter clacked rhythmically whenever we filled prescriptions. My first week was normal. I learned the workflow, met regular patients, dispensed medications for diabetes, blood pressure, antibiotics. Standard stuff. Kiaan was patient, knowledgeable, exactly the kind of preceptor every student hopes for. But on January 8th, I noticed something odd. I was processing a prescription for a patient named Matthew, a combination of 3 medications that seemed unusual. The prescription was handwritten, which isn't uncommon in rural areas. But the handwriting was distinctive, almost old-fashioned. When I checked our system, I found 6 other patients on the exact same combination. Same doses, same quantities, same refill schedule. All different names, all different birth dates, but identical prescriptions. That's not normal. In pharmacy, you rarely see identical medication regimens across multiple patients unless it's something standard like blood pressure protocols. But this combination, a tricyclic antidepressant at a low dose, an anticonvulsant normally used for nerve pain, and a muscle relaxant, didn't match any therapeutic guideline I'd learned. I asked Kiaan about it during a quiet moment. He barely looked up from the prescription he was filling. Old families, he said. They all have similar conditions. Runs in the bloodline. You'll see it more as you get to know the community. That should have satisfied me. Small towns have higher rates of certain conditions due to limited genetic diversity. But something felt off. I'm detail-oriented. It's why I'm good at pharmacy. And this felt wrong. The next day, January 9th, 4 of those patients came in for refills. I helped them at the counter, and that's when I noticed the pattern. They all had the same expression, not quite vacant, but distant, like they were slightly removed from reality. And they all had a tremor in their left hand. Not pronounced, but visible when they signed the credit card machine or counted out cash. Same slight shake, same hand, 4 different people. I'm skeptical by nature. My parents raised me to question superstitions, to trust science and evidence. So I did what any good pharmacy student would do. I researched. That night, in my apartment with the Atlantic wind howling outside, I looked up the medication combination in every database I had access to. There was no legitimate therapeutic reason for this combination. Individually, each drug had its uses. But together, at these specific doses, they would cause very specific neurological effects. Reduced dopamine activity in certain brain regions, increased susceptibility to suggestion, mild cognitive impairment that wouldn't be obvious, but would make complex decision-making difficult. And with long-term use, which these patients had been on, some for over a decade, according to our records. A characteristic tremor in the left hand. The taste of iron filled my mouth. That metallic tang anxiety gives you. I spent the night going through our prescription records, and what I found made my hands shake. 23 patients, all from what Jireh called old families. All on identical prescriptions, all written in the same handwriting. And when I cross-referenced the handwriting with Jireh's notes in patient files, it matched. He was prescribing this combination personally, bypassing the need for physician authorization by using prescription pads from a doctor who died 3 years ago. On January 17, 2024, I remember the exact date because it's when everything changed. I decided to confront him. It was late afternoon, the winter sun already setting at 4:30 p.m., casting long shadows through the pharmacy. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer than usual, and that constant hum felt louder, almost oppressive. "I need to talk to you about these prescriptions," I said, laying out printouts of the 23 identical medication regimens. Jireh looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and his expression wasn't angry or defensive. It was almost pitying. "You'll understand after your first winter here," he said quietly. "Understand what? That you're forging prescriptions? That you're causing neurological damage to patients who trust you?" He sighed, closed the pharmacy door, flipped the sign to closed, even though it was only 4:45. "It's not damage, Ainsley. It's management. Come with me, I'll show you." He led me to the basement, which I'd been told was just storage. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight, and the smell of mildew mixed with that pharmaceutical scent. But at the back of the basement, behind shelves of old inventory, there was a door I'd never noticed. Inside was a small room, more like a large closet. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and on a desk sat records going back decades. Jireh pulled out a file from 1984, then one from 1997, then one from 2006. Different handwriting, different names on the pharmacist licenses, but the same lists of patients, always from the same families and the same medication combinations. "This pharmacy has been here since 1952, Jireh said. "Every pharmacist who's run it has continued this practice. It's not malicious. It's necessary." "Necessary for what?" My voice was shaking. He showed me a journal, leather-bound and old, filled with handwritten notes. The entries described the old families of Pugwash, families who'd been here since the town was founded, families who were described as problematic, difficult to manage, prone to violence and instability. The first pharmacist, someone named Shepard, had started the medication protocol in 1957. He described it as keeping them manageable and maintaining peace in the community. For 40 years, every pharmacist in this building had participated in systematically drugging specific families in Pugwash without their informed consent, creating a medication-induced compliance, keeping certain people chemically subdued, generation after generation. "This is illegal," I said. "This is evil. This is survival," Jireh replied. "You don't know what those families are like without management. The violence, the chaos. This town has been peaceful because we've kept them stable." I backed away from him, from those filing cabinets full of decades of medical violations. "I'm reporting this to the College of Pharmacists, to the police, to everyone." He didn't try to stop me, just nodded sadly. "I know. But you should know. Every student who's been placed here has eventually understood. Given time, you would too." I left that basement and never went back to the pharmacy. I called the College of Pharmacists that night, filed a formal complaint with every detail I'd found. They launched an investigation immediately, and within days, the RCMP were involved. The story made national news for about a week. Rural pharmacy scandal. Decades of unauthorized prescriptions. Gire was charged with multiple counts of fraud and administering noxious substances. The investigation expanded to determine if previous pharmacists could be charged posthumously or if any were still alive. Then, on February 3, 2024, Gire was found dead in his home. Apparent suicide, though the investigation was inconclusive. Without his testimony, the case fell apart. The patients denied knowledge of being drugged. Many defended the pharmacy, said their medications helped them. Without victims willing to press charges, the legal case collapsed. The College of Pharmacists suspended the pharmacy's license, but the damage to my placement was done. I had to complete my rural requirement elsewhere, delaying my graduation. But worse than the career setback was what happened 3 months later. In April 2024, I started noticing a tremor in my left hand. Just slight at first, barely noticeable, but it got worse. I saw 3 different neurologists. They ran every test, MRI, nerve conduction studies, blood work. Everything came back normal. No medical explanation for the tremor. But I know what it is. I was in that pharmacy for only 17 days, but I handled those medications every day. Counted pills, filled prescriptions, breathed in the air of that building. And somehow, whatever has been in Pugwash for 40 years, whether it's in the water, the air, or something else I can't understand, it got into me too. The tremor is worse when I'm stressed or tired. My left hand shakes when I try to write, when I count pills, when I sign my name. It's not in my head. It's real. And every time I see it, I'm reminded that I spent 17 days in a place where systematic poisoning was called management, and mass medication without consent was justified as peace. I graduated pharmacy school in May 2024. I passed my licensing exam. But I can't work as a pharmacist anymore. The tremor makes it impossible to accurately count medications, and no pharmacy will hire someone with an unexplained neurological condition that affects manual dexterity. Sometimes I wonder about those patients in Pugwash. The investigation found that stopping their medications abruptly could cause severe withdrawal effects, potentially dangerous. So a new pharmacist was brought in, and under close supervision, those patients are being slowly weaned off their decades-long medication regimens. I wonder what happens when the chemical compliance wears off completely. I wonder if Gire was right about the violence and chaos. But mostly I wonder about the other students who were placed at that pharmacy over 40 years. Gire said they all eventually understood. How many of them developed tremors? How many of them left pharmacy? How many of them are still out there shaking, knowing what they learned, but unable to prove it or stop it? I keep copies of everything I found, photos of those files, lists of medications, dates and names. They're stored safely because I know how this sounds. I know people think the tremor is psychosomatic, that the stress of the investigation caused a conversion disorder. But I'm a scientist. I know my body. And I know that something in Pugwash got into my system just like it got into those families for generations. The old pharmacy building was sold in August 2024. It's being converted into a coffee shop. They're gutting the interior, tearing out those filing cabinets, painting over decades of secrets. The basement will become storage for coffee beans instead of files documenting systematic drugging. And everyone in Pugwash will drink their lattes and forget that for 40 years, certain families were kept chemically compliant in the name of community peace. I'm 23 years old. I have a pharmacy degree I can't use and a tremor no one can explain. My parents are heartbroken. They sacrificed so much for my education, and now I'm working retail while my hand shakes and my career is over before it started. But I'm alive. I'm not chemically compliant. I'm not being managed. And even though my left hand trembles when I write this, at least I know the truth. At least I reported it. At least I tried. The worst part isn't the tremor or the ruined career. It's knowing that this probably wasn't unique to Pugwash. It's wondering how many other small towns have their own versions of management. How many other pharmacies have basement rooms filled with files justifying the unjustifiable? How many other healthcare providers have convinced themselves that violating consent and autonomy is acceptable if it serves some greater good? I'm detail-oriented, skeptical, scientific. And I learned that sometimes the most horrifying things aren't supernatural or unexplainable. Sometimes they're banal, systematic, carried out by nice people who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Sometimes evil wears a white coat and calls itself necessary. My left hand is shaking as I finish this. Not from fear, not from stress. From whatever was in that building, in that air, in those decades of poisoning disguised as care. It's a permanent reminder that I spent 17 days in a place where medicine was used as a weapon, and I couldn't stop it. But I tried. And maybe that's all any of us can do. See something wrong, report it, and live with whatever consequences come after. Even if those consequences follow us home and never leave. My name is Eddie, and I'm a 67-year-old retired farmer from Ceylon, Saskatchewan. I've lived here my entire life, watched this town grow and shrink with the wheat prices, buried friends and family in the cemetery south of Highway 13. People around here know me as reliable, not given to flights of fancy or exaggeration. When I tell you something, you can believe it's true. That's why what I'm about to tell you is so hard. Because I know it sounds impossible, but every word of it happened. And the worst part isn't what I found in October 2017. The worst part is what I knew 34 years earlier and chose to ignore. Ceylon's grain elevator has been standing since 1952, operated by the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool. It's one of those classic prairie landmarks, tall, weathered, visible for miles across the flat farmland. By 2017, it had been abandoned for nearly 15 years. Windows broken, wood warping, but it was still standing. The town had mixed feelings about it. Some wanted it preserved as heritage, others wanted it torn down before it became dangerous. There's a legend about that elevator, one everyone in town knows. They say a worker died in there back in 1983, got trapped in one of the grain bins and suffocated. Sometimes, especially on quiet nights, you can supposedly hear him inside. The sound of someone gasping for air, pounding on the walls, calling for help. Most people dismissed it as wind through the gaps in the old structure. But I'd heard those sounds myself over the years, driving past late at night with my truck windows down, and they never sounded like wind to me. In October 2017, a developer from Regina put in a proposal to demolish the elevator and build a storage facility. The town council was split. A group of us, mostly older folks who remembered when the elevator was the heartbeat of this community, formed a preservation committee. Our job was to document the interior before any decision was made, create a historical record. I volunteered because I knew that building. I'd worked harvests there in my 20s, climbed those ladders, stood in those grain bins when they were full of wheat and the dust hung in the air so thick you could barely breathe. It seemed fitting that I should be part of preserving its memory. On October 14, 2017, 4 of us went inside with cameras, recording equipment, and flashlights. The building was in worse shape than I'd expected. Grain dust still hung in the air after all these years, that distinctive smell of wheat mixed with something else now. Decay, rot, the smell of wood slowly returning to earth. Every step we took made the floorboards creak, and the prairie wind whistled through gaps in the walls, creating an eerie harmony. We were documenting the main floor when our recording equipment picked up something. At first, we thought it was feedback or interference, but when we played it back, we all heard it clearly. The sound of someone gasping for air. Not once, but repeatedly. Desperate, wet gasps, like someone drowning in grain, suffocating slowly. We looked at each other. One of the women in our group, a school teacher named Emerald, went pale. "That's what they say you hear," she whispered. "The worker who died." But here's the thing. We'd been standing right there when the recording was made. None of us had heard those sounds in real time. They only showed up on playback. We tried it again, recording in different spots throughout the elevator. Every recording captured those same desperate sounds. Gasping, choking, and underneath it, a rhythmic pounding like fists against wood. I should have left then. Should have recognized that whatever was in that elevator wasn't just legend. But I'm stubborn, and I wanted answers. I told the others to wait outside while I checked the grain bins on the upper levels. They didn't argue. No one wanted to climb those old ladders. The bins were dark, the kind of darkness that feels solid, that presses against you. My flashlight cut a weak beam through the grain dust that still floated in the air. Most of the bins were empty, just residue on the walls and floors. But the third bin I checked felt different, colder. And there was something wrong with one of the walls. The boards were loose, pulled slightly away from the frame like something had disturbed them. I got closer, shining my light into the gap. And that's when I saw it. Fabric. A jacket wedged behind the boards, partially buried in grain residue that had gotten behind the wall somehow. My hands were shaking as I pulled the boards away. The jacket came free, and even covered in dust and grain, I recognized it. Carhartt, brown, with a tear on the left sleeve. The same jacket my brother Isael had been wearing the last time I saw him. Isael disappeared in September 1983. He was 23, I was 33. One day he was here, the next he was gone. No note, no explanation. His truck was found parked at the edge of town, keys in the ignition. The RCMP investigated, but there was no evidence of foul play. Eventually, everyone assumed he'd gotten a ride somewhere, started over in another province. People did that sometimes, just left, especially young people who felt trapped by prairie life. But here was his jacket, in a grain elevator, behind a wall in a bin that should have been empty. I pulled more boards away, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might collapse. Behind the jacket, in a space that couldn't have been more than 2 feet deep between the inner and outer walls, was a body. Mummified by the dry grain, preserved in the prairie climate, still recognizable after 34 years. It was Isael. I don't remember climbing down from that bin. Don't remember calling the RCMP. The next clear memory I have is sitting outside the elevator, watching police tape go up, watching the coroner arrive. They brought his body out in a bag, and I had to identify him. Even after 34 years, I knew it was him. But the worst part came 3 days later, when the RCMP returned his personal effects to me. Among them was a small notebook, the kind farmers used to keep in their pockets for tracking expenses. Isael had written in it during his time trapped in that space between the walls. The entries started coherent. September 17th, 1983, the day he disappeared. He'd gone to the elevator looking for work. The regular foreman wasn't there, but someone told him to check the bins on the upper level. While he was inside, he heard the door close. He tried to get out, but it was locked from the outside. He pounded on the walls, shouted for help. But the grain elevator was loud on harvest days, machinery running, trucks coming and going. He wrote that he heard voices outside but couldn't make them loud enough to hear him over the noise. He tried to break through the wall, but the boards were old-growth wood, solid, and he had nothing to use as leverage. The space he was in had some ventilation from gaps between boards, enough to keep him alive initially, but not enough as time went on. The later entries got harder to read. He wrote about thirst, about hunger, about the darkness. But what broke me was the entry from September 24th, a week after he'd been trapped. I can see Eddie through a gap in the boards. He's standing by his truck, talking to someone. I'm pounding as hard as I can. I'm shouting his name. Why won't he look up? Eddie, please, I'm right here. Your brother is right here. Please don't leave. I remember that day, September 24th, 1983. I'd stopped by the elevator to drop off a load. I was talking to the foreman, discussing harvest yields. And I heard something, a sound like pounding, like someone calling out. I remember pausing, looking around, asking the foreman if he heard it. He laughed, said the old building made all kinds of noise, wind through the walls, grain shifting in the bins. I accepted that explanation and drove away. My brother died 3 days later, according to the coroner. Dehydration, organ failure. He'd been trapped in that wall for 10 days, and I'd walked away while he pounded for help 20 feet above my head. The RCMP investigation revealed more. 3 other bodies were found in different sections of the elevator, all in spaces between walls, all in grain bins. One from 1971, one from 1989, one from 2003. Different people, different circumstances, but all apparently locked inside deliberately. None of them had been working there officially. They'd all gone to the elevator looking for casual labor and disappeared. The case is still open. They're trying to identify who was working there during those years, who had keys, who could have locked those doors. But the elevator changed hands multiple times. Records are incomplete, and most of the people who worked there back then are dead or gone. I gave them Isael's journal, told them everything I remembered from that day in 1983. They asked why I hadn't investigated the sounds more thoroughly. I didn't have a good answer. I'd heard something, dismissed it, and moved on with my life, while my brother died calling my name. The developer withdrew his proposal. No one wants to build on ground where 4 bodies were found. The elevator still stands, but now it's fenced off, condemned, waiting for the weather and time to bring it down naturally. I drive past it every day on my way into town. Sometimes, especially at night, I still hear sounds coming from inside. That gasping, that pounding, those calls for help. But now I know they're not legend. They're memory. The building remembering everyone who died inside it, everyone who called out and wasn't heard. I'm 67 years old. I've lived 34 years past the age my brother died. 34 years of farming, of raising kids, of grandchildren and harvest dinners and Christmas mornings. 34 years Isael didn't get because I drove away when he needed me most. People try to comfort me. Say I couldn't have known. Say the foreman should have checked the bins. Say whoever locked those doors is the real villain. And they're right. Someone systematically locked people in that elevator, and I hope they find who did it. But that doesn't change the fact that I heard my brother pounding for help and decided it was just the wind. I can't change what happened. Can't bring Israel back or give him the life he should have had. All I can do is tell this story, make sure people know the truth about that grain elevator. It's not haunted by some anonymous worker from a legend. It's a tomb where at least 4 people died, where they called for help and weren't heard, where the prairie wind covers their sounds and makes people dismiss what they're really hearing. Ceylon is a small town. Everyone knows everyone, and we all drive past that elevator multiple times a day. I wonder how many other people heard something over the years and explained it away. I wonder how many of us carry guilt we haven't spoken about, sounds we dismissed, moments we could have investigated but didn't. The RCMP told me Iziel was probably dead within 3 days of when I drove past him. So even if I'd investigated that sound, had them open the bins, looked harder, it probably wouldn't have saved him. But I'll never know for sure. That's what I live with now. The not knowing. The possibility that 3 more days of searching could have mattered. I go to the cemetery every week. Iziel's buried there now, proper funeral, proper headstone. 34 years late, but at least he's home. His journal is evidence, locked away somewhere in an RCMP facility. But I have photocopies. I read them sometimes, torturing myself with his words, with the moment he saw me and thought he was saved, with his confusion and despair when I drove away. The town is divided on what to do with the elevator. Some want it torn down immediately, erased, forgotten. Others want it preserved as a memorial, a reminder of what happened. I don't have an opinion anymore. Whether it stands or falls, those 4 people are still dead. Iziel is still dead. And I'm still the brother who didn't hear him when he called. That's the real horror, isn't it? Not ghosts or supernatural forces, but the ordinary human failure to pay attention, to investigate, to care enough to look harder. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just locks a door and walks away, knowing that anyone who hears the pounding will explain it away as wind or settling or the normal sounds of an old building. And sometimes the person who walks away is someone who should have known better. Someone who should have recognized his own brother's voice calling for help. I'm Eddie. I'm 67 years old. I'm a retired farmer from Ceylon, Saskatchewan, and I'm the man who heard his brother dying and decided it was nothing. That's my truth. That's what I live with. And every time the wind blows through that abandoned grain elevator, I hear it. Not a legend, not a ghost. Just the echo of the moment I failed, preserved forever in creaking wood and prairie silence. My name is Arden, and I'm a 31-year-old high school English teacher. In September 2022, I moved from Vancouver to Flin Flon, Manitoba, chasing an idealistic dream of making a difference in a small community. I wanted to inspire students who didn't have access to the resources of big city schools to show them that literature could open worlds. Instead, I discovered that some small towns have secrets that generations have agreed never to question, and that the most dangerous thing a teacher can do is actually care about their students. 4 months after I arrived, I left with a terminated contract, a student dead, and the knowledge that I'm still being watched, even 500 kilometers away in a different province. Flin Flon is a mining town, population about 5,000, right on the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The town was built around copper mining, and even though the big operations have scaled down, mining is still the heartbeat of the community. The high school serves about 400 students, grades 9 through 12, and when I arrived in September, I was genuinely excited. Small class sizes, students who knew each other their whole lives, a tight-knit community. It seemed perfect. Room 204 became my home base. It smelled like old textbooks and floor cleaner, that institutional scent every teacher knows. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly and flickered in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. I used to joke with students that it was Morse code. The building was old, built in the 1960s, with those thick concrete walls that made it feel simultaneously solid and oppressive. My first month was everything I'd hoped for. Students were engaged, responsive, eager to discuss literature. One student in particular stood out, a 16-year-old girl I'll call Hannah. She was bright, thoughtful, always stayed after class to discuss books. She wanted to be a writer, showed me poetry she'd written, short stories that showed real talent. She reminded me why I became a teacher. Then, in early October, Hannah changed. She stopped participating in class, stopped making eye contact, started wearing long sleeves even though the classroom was warm. When I asked if everything was okay, she just nodded and looked away. The light in her had dimmed, and I couldn't figure out why. On October 18th, 2022, I assigned a creative writing project. Write a short story about your community, fiction or nonfiction. Hannah turned in a story that made my blood run cold. It was titled The Real History, and described a town where children were taken to an old mine once a year, where they performed rituals to feed something that lived deep in the copper veins. The story described specific symbols carved into mine walls, described burn marks on children's arms as marks of participation, described how everyone in town knew, but no one ever spoke about it. At the top of her story, in red pen, she'd written, "Non-fiction." I should have reported it immediately to counselors, to administration. But I made the mistake of thinking I could handle it myself, that I could help her directly. I asked Hannah to stay after class. She refused to elaborate, said it was just a story. But her hands were shaking when she said it. Then other students started submitting similar stories. Different writing styles, different perspectives, but all referencing the old mine and what we feed it. By the end of October, I'd received 8 stories with nearly identical themes, all marked nonfiction, all describing rituals involving children, symbols, burn marks, and a town-wide conspiracy of silence. Have you ever felt like everyone around you knows something you don't, and they're all waiting to see if you'll figure it out? That's what those weeks felt like. Students would exchange glances when I brought up the stories. Other teachers changed the subject when I tried to discuss it in the staff room. The principal told me I was overanalyzing creative fiction and to focus on grammar and structure instead. On November 3rd, I decided to investigate myself. The old copper mine was about 5 kilometers outside town, officially closed since 1985, but the entrance wasn't sealed. I hiked out there on a Saturday afternoon, telling myself I was just being thorough, just ruling out possibilities. The mine entrance was dark, cold, and smelled like wet stone and copper. I had a flashlight and stupidly, arrogantly, went inside. The main tunnel went about 50 meters before branching off. And on the walls, carved deep into the stone, were symbols. Circles within circles, lines radiating outward, patterns that looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet I recognized. But here's what made me know the students' stories weren't fiction. The carvings were fresh, not decades old, not weathered by time. Recent, within the last few years at least. And beneath some of them, on the mine floor, were the remnants of candles. Lots of candles. And burn marks on the stone walls at roughly waist height for a teenager. I took photos, documented everything. Went home and didn't sleep that night, trying to figure out what to do with this information. Report it to police? But report what? carvings in an abandoned mine, contact Child Protection Services. But I had no evidence of actual abuse, just creative writing and symbols in a mine. The decision was made for me on November 8th. Hannah appeared at my apartment at 11 p.m. I lived in a small building near the school, and when I heard knocking, I found her on my doorstep, crying, terrified. She begged me to stop asking questions, to stop investigating, to just teach English and ignore everything else. "You don't understand," she said. "This is bigger than you. This is everyone. And they know you went to the mine." When I asked how they knew, she just looked at me with these hollow eyes and said, "They always know." Then she showed me her arms, pulled up her sleeves, and revealed burned scars, circular patterns that matched the symbols I'd seen in the mine. Fresh scars, still healing, alongside older ones that had faded to white. Years of scars. Ritualistic patterns burned into her skin. "Please," she whispered. "If you keep pushing, they'll hurt more students to prove a point. Or they'll hurt you. Just stop." She left before I could respond, disappeared into the November darkness. I immediately called Child Protection Services, filed a formal report detailing everything, the stories, the mine, Hannah's scars. They said they'd investigate. On November 15th, I decided to bring it up publicly. There was a school assembly, whole student body gathered in the gymnasium. The principal was making announcements about upcoming events when I stood up and asked to address the students. What I said was simple. If anyone is being hurt, if anyone is being forced to participate in activities they don't want to, please know that you can talk to me. You can get help. You don't have to be silent. The gymnasium went quiet. And then, slowly, every student stood up. Not in support, in unison. 400 students rising at exactly the same moment, like they'd rehearsed it. The sound of chairs scraping, lockers slamming in the hallway beyond, all perfectly synchronized. They turned toward the exits and walked out in complete silence. No talking, no confusion, just coordinated departure. I stood there watching 400 teenagers execute a silent, unified rejection of everything I'd said. And the teachers, every single one, just watched. No one tried to stop them. No one looked surprised. That afternoon, I was called to the principal's office. By then, 37 parents had contacted the superintendent complaining about me, disrupting the educational environment, and making baseless accusations. The Manitoba Teachers Society representative was there, along with the principal and vice principal. I was suspended pending investigation. The investigation concluded that I had violated student privacy by discussing their creative writing publicly, had trespassed on private property, the mine, and had created a hostile environment through unfounded allegations. My contract was terminated on January 20th, 2023, 5 months after I'd arrived full of idealism and hope. Child Protection Services found no evidence of abuse after interviewing students who all gave identical statements that their scars were from accidents and normal teenage behavior. I left Flin Flon on January 25th, moved to Winnipeg, found a job at a bookstore while I figured out my next steps. 2 weeks after I left, on February 8th, Hannah was found dead in her parents' garage. Carbon monoxide poisoning ruled suicide. She was 16 years old. I tried to contact authorities, tried to tell them it wasn't suicide, that she'd been silenced. They told me grief was making me irrational, that I should seek counseling. Her parents released a statement saying she'd been struggling with depression exacerbated by a teacher's inappropriate intervention. That should have been the end. I should have moved on, tried to rebuild my career, tried to forget. But 3 weeks after Hannah died, I received a letter at my new apartment in Winnipeg. No return address, postmarked from Flin Flon. Inside were photos of me, inside my new apartment, taken through my window. Me making coffee, me reading on my couch, me sleeping. The photos were time-stamped from the previous week. Someone had traveled from Flin Flon to Winnipeg to photograph me in my new home, to let me know they knew where I was, that leaving town didn't mean leaving their reach. I reported it to Winnipeg police. They filed a report but said without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I installed curtains, stopped sleeping near windows, started checking over my shoulder constantly. That was 8 months ago. I've received 3 more letters since then, each with new photos from different angles, different times of day. Proof that I'm still being watched, still being monitored. I don't teach anymore. Can't. My teaching license is technically still active. But no school will hire someone whose last position ended in termination and whose online presence includes newspaper articles about troubled teacher who made false allegations. I work retail now, stock shelves, try to stay invisible. But sometimes I wonder about the other teachers at that school. The ones who looked away when the students walked out. The ones who've been there for years, decades even. Did they all start like me? Idealistic, wanting to help? And at what point did they learn to stop asking questions, to ignore the signs, to participate in the collective silence? I think about Hannah constantly, about the scars on her arms, about the terror in her eyes when she begged me to stop, about the fact that I didn't stop, and 2 weeks after I left, she was dead. People keep telling me it's not my fault, that I did the right thing by reporting what I saw. But Hannah is still dead, and I'm still alive and being watched, and nothing changed in Flin Flon. The mine is still there. The symbols are still carved in the walls. And every year, I assume, more students get those circular burn scars, more children participate in whatever happens in that darkness, and more teachers learn to focus on grammar and structure instead of asking why their students write horror stories marked nonfiction. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to save students like Hannah. Instead, I learned that some systems are too big, too entrenched, too protected by collective silence to be challenged by one idealistic teacher with a conscience. And I learned that the price of trying isn't just losing your career. It's living with the knowledge that your intervention got someone killed and changed nothing. The fluorescent lights in my current apartment flicker sometimes. And even though I know it's just faulty wiring, it reminds me of room 204, of that rhythmic pattern that students said was Morse code. I never learned what message it was sending, but I think about it now. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe the building itself was trying to tell me to look away, to stop seeing, to join the silence. I'm 31 years old. I'll probably never teach again. I check my mailbox with dread, waiting for the next letter with photos proving I'm still under surveillance. I've thought about moving again, changing my name, disappearing completely. But I don't think it would matter. Flin Flon has a long reach, and they've made it clear that leaving town doesn't mean leaving their attention. What I can't figure out is why they're watching me. I didn't stop them. I didn't save anyone. I failed completely. So why the continued surveillance? Is it a warning to stay silent? A reminder of what happens when you ask questions? Or is it something worse? Are they waiting to see if I'll try again, if I'll go to media, if I'll become enough of a threat to require more permanent silencing? I don't know. And the not knowing is its own form of torture. Every letter that arrives, every glimpse of someone who might be watching, every noise outside my window at night. They're all reminders that I saw something I shouldn't have seen, tried to help someone I couldn't help, and now I live in the shadow of a small town secret that reaches far beyond its borders. Hannah would have been 17 now. She wanted to be a writer. She had talent and dreams and a future. And she's dead because I convinced myself I could be the teacher who makes a difference, who saves the vulnerable student, who stands up to corruption. I was wrong, and she paid the price. And somewhere in Flin Flon, in an old high school that smells like textbooks and floor cleaner, other students are sitting in room 204 with scars under their long sleeves, writing stories marked nonfiction, waiting to see if their new teacher will make the same mistake I did. I hope that teacher is smarter than me. I hope they know when to look away. My name is Noor, and I'm a 38-year-old RCMP constable with 12 years on the force. I'm Cree, raised between two worlds, traditional teachings from my grandmother and modern law enforcement training from the academy. For most of my career, those worlds never conflicted. I investigated crimes, followed evidence, upheld the law. But in December 2021, on a remote stretch of Highway 1 near Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories, I encountered something that shattered the clean boundary between rational and irrational. 17 people disappeared from that highway over 3 weeks, and I responded to 7 of those calls. I felt what they felt. I know why they walked into that forest. And the only reason I'm still here to tell this story is because I handcuffed myself to my patrol vehicle before I could follow them. Fort Simpson is tiny, population around 1,200, sitting at the confluence of the Mackenzie and Liard rivers. Highway 1 is the only road in and out, stretching across tundra and boreal forest, isolated and dangerous in winter. We get plenty of calls about abandoned vehicles, breakdowns, accidents, drivers who misjudge the cold. But what happened starting December 8, 2021 was different from anything in my 12 years of service. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Trucker reported abandoned vehicle on Highway 1, about 40 kilometers south of town. Hazard lights still flashing, engine running, driver's door open. When I arrived 20 minutes later, the scene was exactly as described. A white Toyota Camry, maybe 5 years old, sitting at an odd angle partially off the road. Hazards on, engine idling, heat running full blast. The driver's door was wide open, dome light illuminating an empty interior. Temperature was -35. The northern lights flickered overhead, green and purple bands dancing across the sky. Everything was silent except for the sound of ice cracking on the frozen river maybe a kilometer away, and the idling engine. No wind, just cold so intense it burned your lungs with every breath. I approached with my flashlight and immediately saw the problem. The driver was gone. Purse still on the passenger seat, phone plugged into the charger, winter coat hanging on the back of the driver's seat. No one abandons their vehicle in -35 without their coat. No one survives more than 10 minutes in that cold without proper clothing. I called it in, requested search and rescue, and began documenting the scene. That's when I found the dash cam. It was still recording, little red light blinking on the windshield mount. I stopped the recording and brought the SD card back to my vehicle to review while I waited for backup. The footage showed the driver clearly. A woman, maybe early 30s, indigenous features, driving normally. She was listening to music, occasionally singing along, completely at ease. Then, at timestamp 11:21 p.m., she suddenly went quiet. Her head turned slowly to the left, staring at the tree line maybe 50 meters off the road. The car slowed to a stop. She put it in park, left the engine running, and opened the door. The dashcam angle didn't show her leaving, but I could see the interior light come on and stay on. 8 seconds of silence, then the audio picked up her voice, distant but clear. I have to go home now. Pause. I have to go home now. Another pause. I have to go home now. 7 times she repeated that phrase, her voice getting quieter as she walked away from the vehicle. No emotion, no fear, just flat repetition. Then silence. The dashcam kept recording for another 26 minutes until I arrived. Just showing empty road and that dark tree line, illuminated by the Camry's headlights. Search and rescue arrived at 12:45 a.m. We found her tracks immediately, boot prints in the fresh snow leading directly toward the tree line. She hadn't wandered or circled, just walked in a straight line. We followed the tracks 3 kilometers into the forest. The trail was perfect, unbroken, showing someone walking steadily through deep snow. No signs of struggle, no signs of stopping or falling, just steady boot prints heading north. Then, 3 kilometers in, the tracks stopped. Not faded, not obscured by wind, just stopped. Mid-step. Her left boot print was clear in the snow, and then nothing. No right boot print, no scuff marks, no indication she'd jumped or been lifted. The track simply ended as if she'd ceased to exist mid-stride. I've been trained to find rational explanations. Wind could have covered tracks, but there was no wind that night. Animals could have obscured them, but the snow around that final print was completely undisturbed. Someone could have carried her, but there were no other tracks, no signs of another person. The evidence said she took one more step and vanished. We searched for 3 days. Helicopters, search dogs, ground teams. Found nothing. No body, no additional tracks, no signs of struggle. The woman was identified from her license as a local resident, worked at the general store, had no history of mental illness or suicidal ideation. Just disappeared into the forest after repeating, "I have to go home now," 7 times. The case should have been closed as unexplained disappearance, filed away, moved on from. But on December 11th, 3 days later, another abandoned vehicle was reported. Different location, 5 kilometers north of the first site. Same circumstances. Hazards on, engine running, door open, coat left behind. And dashcam footage showing the driver, this time a man in his 40s, stopping his vehicle, staring at the tree line and walking away saying, "I have to go home now," over and over. I responded to that call. Found the same pattern. Tracks leading into the forest, stopping abruptly 3 kilometers in. Nothing else. No explanation. When I approached the tree line during that second investigation, something happened that I've never reported in any official capacity. I felt it. A pull. Not physical, but undeniable. An overwhelming compulsion to walk into those trees. A knowing deep in my bones that I needed to go into that forest. That I was supposed to be there. That it was time to go home. I understood instantly why those people walked away from their vehicles without coats, without phones, without any survival instinct overriding them. Because in that moment, the cold didn't matter. Survival didn't matter. There was only the certainty that I belonged in those trees, and I needed to start walking. I backed away from the tree line, got in my patrol vehicle, filed my report, and didn't mention the compulsion because I'm a trained RCMP officer with 12 years of service, and admitting to irrational compulsions isn't something you do if you want to keep your badge. But it happened again on December 14th. Third abandoned vehicle. I responded. Felt the pull stronger this time. Physically had to restrain myself from leaving my vehicle and walking into the forest. By December 18th, 7 vehicles had been abandoned on that stretch of Highway 1. 7 people vanished, and I'd responded to every single call. Each time, the pull was stronger. Each time, it took more willpower to resist. On the 7th call, I handcuffed myself to my patrol vehicle's steering wheel before approaching the tree line. Stood there, 20 meters from the forest, handcuffs cutting into my wrist, while every fiber of my being screamed at me to walk forward, to go home, to stop resisting. My radio kept producing static the closer I got to the tree line. The northern lights overhead seemed brighter, more active, pulsing in rhythm with something I couldn't name. And underneath the sound of my own breathing and the ice cracking on the distant river, I swear I heard voices. Not words exactly, but tones. Inviting, welcoming, promising something I couldn't articulate but desperately wanted. I called for backup and waited in my vehicle, still handcuffed, until another officer arrived. I told him I'd dropped my keys, needed bolt cutters to remove the cuffs. Didn't mention why I'd cuffed myself in the first place. The RCMP launched a formal investigation. Highway 1 in that area was cordoned off, restricted to emergency vehicles only. Indigenous liaison officers were brought in to consult with elders from the community. My grandmother, who's in her 80s and still practices traditional ways, came to my apartment when she heard what was happening. "That place has always been hungry," she said quietly. "Our people knew never to linger there, especially in winter when the lights dance. Something lives in those trees, something older than memory. It calls people home, but it's not their home it takes them to." I asked what it was. She shook her head. "Some things don't have names in any language. Naming them gives them more power. Your people," she meant the RCMP, white law enforcement, "will try to explain it away. Hallucinations. From cold, carbon monoxide, from idling engines, mental breaks. But you felt it. You know it's real." I did know. But knowing didn't help when I had to write reports, when supervisors demanded rational explanations, when the media started asking questions about why the RCMP couldn't solve 7 disappearances. 10 more people vanished over the next week. 17 total by December 26th. All abandoned vehicles, all with dashcam footage showing drivers stopping and walking away. All repeating some variation of "I have to go home now." All tracks ending 3 kilometers into the forest at slightly different locations, but all facing north. I requested a transfer on December 28th. Told my superiors I was experiencing stress from the cases, needed a change of environment. They approved it without question, probably relieved to have me out of the investigation since my reports had started sounding increasingly irrational. I was transferred to a detachment near Yellowknife in February 2022. Quiet area, normal calls, nothing out of the ordinary. But I can't drive anymore. Can't trust myself behind the wheel, especially at night. Because sometimes, on certain stretches of road, I feel it again. That pull, that knowing, that certainty that I need to stop my vehicle, leave everything behind, and walk into whatever darkness calls to me. The official investigation concluded that the disappearances were likely due to a combination of factors: extreme cold, possible carbon monoxide exposure from idling vehicles, and mass psychogenic illness triggered by the first disappearance. The area remains officially cordoned off, though compliance is limited. People still use that highway. I've heard through informal channels that 3 more people have disappeared from that stretch since I left. The RCMP doesn't publicize it anymore. Bad for tourism, bad for morale, bad for rational explanations. Sometimes I see her. The first woman, the one whose dash cam I reviewed. I'll be walking in Yellowknife, and I'll glimpse her in a crowd. She's always walking in the same direction, north, moving with purpose through throngs of people who don't notice her. When I try to follow, she vanishes. But I see her face clearly each time. She looks peaceful, content, like she's going home. My grandmother told me that the people who answer the call don't die. Not exactly. They go somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to our world, but not part of it. She said I'm lucky I resisted, but also that the call doesn't forget. Once it's felt, it never fully leaves. I'll hear it for the rest of my life. Quieter now, but always present, waiting for a moment of weakness or despair when I might stop resisting. I'm 38 years old. I've served in the RCMP for 12 years. I've investigated murders, assaults, thefts, fraud. I've seen the worst humanity can do to itself. But nothing prepared me for that highway, for that forest, for the realization that there are forces in this world that don't care about badges or training or rational thought. 17 people are gone. 17 people answered a call I heard but didn't follow. I should feel relieved that I survived, but instead I feel guilty. Guilty that I'm here and they're not. Guilty that I felt the same pull, but had handcuffs and backup to prevent me from following through. Guilty that I can't explain to their families where they went or why. The dashcam footage has been sealed as evidence. The investigation remains technically open, but effectively closed. And I'm here in Yellowknife, working normal calls, trying to rebuild a career, knowing that everything I was trained to believe about the world, about evidence and logic and rational explanations, was inadequate for what I experienced. My grandmother gave me medicines before I left. Sweetgrass, tobacco, things she said would protect me. I keep them in my patrol vehicle even though it's probably against regulations. Because whatever called those 17 people into the forest doesn't respect regulations or borders or the authority of law enforcement. It just calls, and calls, and calls. And someday, when I'm tired enough, or weak enough, or desperate enough, I might stop fighting. I might pull over on some remote highway, leave my vehicle running, and walk toward whatever promises to take me home. I hope that day never comes. But I felt what those 17 people felt. I know the peace they experienced in those moments before they disappeared. And I understand why not one of them hesitated. Why not one of them turned back? Because when something that fundamental calls you, reason doesn't matter anymore. Only the call matters. Only going home. Whatever home means to it. My name is Cedric, and I'm a 44-year-old IT consultant who works from home. In May 2023, 6 months after my wife died, I bought a 1920s farmhouse on 10 acres outside Hazelton, British Columbia, for $185,000, about half what comparable properties were selling for. The realtor said the previous owner had died in the house, natural causes, no family to claim the estate. I'm a logical person, an IT professional who deals in systems and solutions. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or any of that superstitious nonsense. But I do believe in following rules when breaking them has consequences I've witnessed firsthand. And I believe that some places have things living in them that don't show up on security cameras, but will use your dead wife's voice to try to trick you into opening your door at 3 in the morning. The property seemed perfect for what I needed. Isolation, quiet, enough space that I wouldn't be constantly reminded of the life I'd lost. My nearest neighbor is 2 kilometers away through dense forest. The house needed work but had good bones, and the price was right for someone trying to start over on a single income. I moved in on May 15th, 2023, with my computer equipment, minimal furniture, and a desperate need to be somewhere that didn't smell like the hospital where my wife spent her final weeks. The first 2 weeks were peaceful. I set up my home office, installed high-speed satellite internet since cable doesn't reach out here, established my work routine. The darkness at night was absolute. No light pollution, just stars and silence and the smell of earth and pine. It was exactly what I needed. Isolating, yes. But isolation felt like mercy after months of condolences and pitying looks from people who didn't know what to say. On May 29th, I decided to explore the basement more thoroughly. I'd been down there briefly during the inspection, but it was dark and cluttered with decades of accumulated junk from previous owners. In the far corner, behind a broken freezer and stacks of old newspapers, I found a door I hadn't noticed before. It was locked with a heavy padlock, the kind you use to secure something valuable or dangerous. I'm an IT consultant. I solve problems. Locked doors bother me. I cut the padlock with bolt cutters I'd bought for property maintenance and opened the door. The room was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, completely empty except for what was written on the walls. Every surface, all 4 walls, the ceiling, even parts of the floor, was covered in warnings written in black marker. Some were faded, clearly years old. Others were fresh, written in shaking handwriting. Stay inside after dark. Don't answer the knocks. They look like people, but they're not. 3:17 am every new moon. If you hear voices you know, don't listen. Generator must work, check monthly. Leaving after sunset, death. They wear faces of the dead. There were dozens more. Variations on the same themes, written by different hands over what must have been decades. Dates were scattered among the warnings, going back to 1987. The most recent was dated April 2023, 1 month before the previous owner died. I stood in that room for 20 minutes, reading every warning, and my first reaction was to laugh. Some previous owner with dementia or mental illness had created this paranoid shrine, and subsequent owners had added to it as a joke or out of their own declining mental state. The realtor had mentioned the previous owner was elderly, found dead in his bed. Natural causes. Clearly the man had been suffering from delusions. I'm logical. I deal in evidence and systems. So I dismissed it, took photos for the curiosity factor, and went back upstairs to work. That night, May 29th, 2023, a new moon according to my phone's calendar. I learned that some warnings are written in desperation by people who discovered rules the hard way. I was working late, debugging code for a client, when my phone showed 3:16 a.m. I was about to shut down for the night when I heard it. Knocking. Not at one door, but all of them simultaneously. Front door, back door, basement door, even the door to the storage shed attached to the house. Rhythmic, steady knocking, perfectly synchronized. My security system, a ring setup I'd installed the first week, started sending alerts. Motion detected at front door. Motion at back door. Motion at basement entrance. Motion at shed door, all at exactly 3:17 a.m. I pulled up the camera feeds on my laptop. The night vision showed the doors clearly, showed the areas in front of them. Nothing. No people, no animals. Nothing that could be causing the knocking. But the knocking continued, steady and insistent, and the motion sensors kept triggering. I sat frozen at my desk, watching empty doorways on my screen while something knocked on every entrance to my house with perfect synchronization. The sound was wrong, not the hollow knock of knuckles on wood, but something heavier, more deliberate. After 5 minutes, the knocking stopped. All at once, like it had started. The motion alert stopped. My phone showed 3:22 a.m. Complete silence returned, broken only by my own breathing and the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. Sat at my desk until dawn, going through the security footage frame by frame. Nothing. No figures, no shadows. Nothing that explained synchronized knocking on 4 different doors. But when I listened to the audio recording and counted the knocks, then looked up Morse code patterns because I'm thorough and logical and needed an explanation, the knocking spelled out a message. LETUSIN. The next day, I checked the generator the basement warnings had mentioned. It was old, poorly maintained, and when I tried to start it, nothing happened. Fuel line was clogged. Battery was dead. The previous owner had clearly stopped maintaining it, and according to the warnings, that was a critical mistake. I spent $200 getting it professionally serviced and repaired. The technician asked why I needed such a robust backup system for a home office. I told him power outages in rural areas were common. He nodded and said the previous owner had been real particular about keeping the generator in working order until the last year or so. Guess he gave up caring, the technician said. Found him dead a few weeks after I told him the generator was failing, and he said he wasn't going to fix it. Seemed resigned to something. June brought the next new moon. I was prepared this time. Doors locked, security system active, work finished before midnight so I wouldn't be distracted. At 3:17 a.m., the knocking started again. Same pattern, same synchronization, same empty camera feeds showing nothing at the doors. But this time, I looked out the window toward the tree line about 50 meters from the house. And I saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the forest. In the complete darkness, I shouldn't have been able to see them at all. But they were somehow visible, like they generated their own faint illumination. There were 4 of them, standing perfectly still, facing the house. And even from that distance, even in the darkness, I could see what they were wearing. My wife's clothes, the dress she wore to our anniversary dinner, the sweater she loved, the jeans and blouse from 100 ordinary days. 4 figures wearing her clothes, standing motionless at the tree line. The knocking continued for 5 minutes. The figures didn't move. When the knocking stopped at 3:22 a.m., the figures turned in unison and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees. I added more cameras the next day, reinforced the doors with additional locks, bought supplies, food, water, batteries, enough to last weeks without leaving the house. Because one of those warnings in the basement said, "Leaving after sunset, death." And I was starting to understand that whoever wrote these rules had learned them through experience I didn't want to repeat. The July new moon brought escalation. Same knocking at 3:17 a.m. Same figures at the tree line, but closer this time, maybe 30 meters from the house. Still wearing my wife's clothes, still perfectly still. But this time, as the knocking ended, I heard her voice. My wife's voice, clear and distinct, calling from outside. "Cedric, I'm cold. Please let me in." The exact words she'd said the night before she died, when the hospital room was freezing and I'd piled blankets on her bed and held her hand and promised her everything would be okay. Her last coherent words before the morphine took her beyond communication. Something outside my house knew those words. Had her voice perfect, the weakness in it, the slight tremor, the love and fear and resignation all mixed together. And it was using that memory as a weapon to get me to open my door. I didn't open it. Sat in my office with my hands over my ears while my dead wife's voice begged to be let in, while something wearing her clothes stood in my yard, while the knocking spelled out LETUSIN over and over in Morse code. The August new moon was worse. Power failed at 3:15 a.m. Not the main line, but something cut power to the entire house 2 minutes before the knocking started. My security system switched to battery backup, my computer to UPS. And then I remembered the generator. I ran to the basement, hit the starter. It roared to life immediately. The expensive service had been worth it. Power restored. Lights came back on. And at 3:17 a.m. precisely, the knocking started. But this time, the figures weren't at the tree line. They were at the windows. 4 figures wearing my wife's clothes, faces pressed against the glass. And in the light from inside the house, I could see those faces clearly. They were her face. Exact copies. Perfect down to the small scar on her cheek from a childhood accident, down to the pattern of her freckles, down to the expression she had when she was trying to solve a problem. 4 versions of my dead wife staring in at me from different windows while her voice called from outside. "Cedric, please, I'm so cold. Why won't you let me in? Don't you love me anymore?" The knocking continued. The faces at the windows didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared with her eyes while her voice begged and pleaded and used every memory of our marriage as ammunition. At 3:22 a.m., they left, stepped back from the windows, walked toward the tree line, disappeared into the forest. My security cameras showed nothing, just empty yards, empty windows, no figures at all. But I saw them. I heard her voice, and I knew that whatever was out there had been studying me, learning what would hurt most, preparing for the moment when I'd be weak enough or desperate enough to break the rules. September, October, November, every new moon, the same pattern. Knocking at 3:17 a.m., figures wearing her clothes, using her face, speaking with her voice. Each time they get closer before retreating at 3:22. Each time the mimicry gets better, more detailed, more emotionally manipulative. It's December now. Tomorrow is the new moon. I've reinforced every door and window. The generator is maintained and tested weekly. I have supplies for a month without leaving the house. And I've started writing my own warnings in that basement room, adding to decades of desperate messages from previous owners who learned the same rules I'm learning. Because I can't leave? Not without passing through that tree line after dark, and I've seen what waits there. The property is surrounded by forest on all sides. The only access road requires driving through 2 kilometers of trees. And the warnings are clear. Leaving after sunset means death. I work from home. I order supplies delivered during daylight hours, meeting the delivery drivers at the edge of my driveway. I haven't physically seen another human being in months. I video chat with clients, maintain professional relationships through screens, and everyone thinks I'm just a widower who prefers isolation. They're right, in a way. I do prefer this isolation to the alternative. Because I've seen what the alternative is. I've watched it wear my wife's face and use her voice, and stand outside my windows, promising comfort and love, and an end to loneliness if I'll just open the door. My wife died of cancer. It was slow, painful, and despite every medical intervention, it took her anyway. I held her hand as she slipped away, watched her take her last breath, and thought that was the worst thing I'd ever experienced. But I was wrong. The worst thing is hearing her voice months later, begging to be let in, knowing it's not her, knowing something is using her memory as bait. I'm writing this between work calls, documenting everything for whoever buys this property after I die. Because I will die here. That's not pessimism. That's understanding the situation. I can't leave after dark, and eventually something will fail. The generator will break down at the wrong time. I'll have a medical emergency that can't wait for dawn. Or I'll simply grow old enough that one night I won't wake up when the knocking starts. The price was right on this property. I understand why now. Every owner learns the rules or dies learning them. Every owner adds their warnings to that basement room. Every owner stays because leaving means facing what's in those trees. And whatever is out there is patient and hungry and very, very good at wearing the faces of people you've lost. Tomorrow is the new moon. At 3:17 a.m. they'll knock. They'll wear her clothes and her face. They'll use her voice to beg and plead and try to break my resolve. And I'll sit in my reinforced house with my working generator and my locked doors and my security cameras that see nothing, and I'll survive another night. Because the alternative is opening that door. And I've read enough warnings from previous owners to know that no one who opens the door ever writes warnings afterward. I'm Cedric. I'm 44 years old. I'm a widower and an IT consultant and a homeowner in Hazelton, British Columbia. And I'm writing this so whoever comes next will understand the rules before they learn them the hard way. Stay inside after dark. Don't answer the knocks. They look like people, but they're not. And no matter who they sound like, no matter what they promise, no matter how much you miss the person they're pretending to be, don't open the door. The price on this property was right for a reason, and that reason is waiting at the tree line every new moon, wearing faces of the dead, learning your weaknesses, waiting for you to break. I won't break. But I'm not sure about whoever comes next. Cedric is still in that house, still following the rules, still hearing his wife's voice every new moon. He can't leave, he won't open the door, and he's writing warnings for whoever comes next. That's real horror. No ending, just survival. If this story left you unsettled, hit that like button. Subscribe for more declassified cases from real people who lived through the unexplainable. Share this with someone brave enough to listen. New files drop every night. The truth is waiting. Stay safe out there, if you can.